The Imperium of Man had weathered nearly 5,000 years of existence by the closing centuries of the 35th millennium. What had begun as the Emperor's grand vision, a unified human empire stretching across the stars, had calcified into a sprawling bureaucratic monstrosity. The golden ideals of the Great Crusade era had long since tarnished, replaced by dogma, superstition, and the endless machinery of imperial administration. In these shadowed centuries, the foundations for one of the Imperium's darkest periods were being quietly laid. The Age of Apostasy would not erupt suddenly. Rather, it grew from seeds planted in the fertile soil of imperial decay, watered by ambition and fertilized by the gradual erosion of the safeguards established after the Horus Heresy. The late 35th millennium saw the Imperium increasingly beset by external threats. Orc empires rose and fell along the galactic rim. The Eldar, though diminished, continued their enigmatic raids from webway portals and craft worlds. New Xenos threats emerged from previously unexplored regions of space. Within this climate of perpetual war, the administrative structures of the Imperium began to strain and crack. The High Lords of Terra, established as the supreme ruling council after the Emperor's internment in the Golden Throne, had been conceived as a system of checks and balances. No single individual or organization was meant to dominate imperial governance. The Fabricator General balanced the Lord Commander Militant. The Grand Provost Marshal counterweighted the paternoval envoy of the Navis Nobilite. This delicate equilibrium had preserved the Imperium through millennia of challenges. Yet by the 36th millennium, this balance had begun to shift. The most significant change came in the form of the Adeptus Ministorum, the ecclesiarchy, whose influence had grown exponentially since its official recognition as the state religion in the 32nd millennium. What had begun as a cult devoted to the Emperor's divinity had transformed into the spiritual backbone of the Imperium, with tendrils reaching into every aspect of human existence across a million worlds. The ecclesiarchy's rise was not accidental. As interstellar communication grew increasingly unreliable due to warp storms and bureaucratic inefficiency, the shared faith in the God Emperor became one of the few unifying forces across disparate human worlds. Local planetary governors found that cooperation with ecclesiarchy representatives ensured popular support. Imperial commanders discovered that troops fought more fervently when blessed by ministorum priests. The Adeptus Administratum realized that tax collection improved when sanctified by religious authority. This practical utility translated into increasing wealth and power. Planetary tithes now included donations to the ecclesiarchy. Vast cathedrals and shrines consumed the wealth of entire systems. Forge worlds produced ornate reliquaries and golden aquillas alongside battle tanks and lasguns. The Ministorum's headquarters on Terra, the ecclesiarchal palace, grew to rival even the imperial palace in grandeur, if not in size. More concerning than this accumulation of wealth was the ecclesiarchy's growing military power. Despite ancient prohibitions against the ecclesiarchy commanding men under arms, a restriction dating back to the reforms after the Age of Apostasy itself, the Ministorum had found ways to circumvent these limitations. Fraterist Templar units formed as defensive forces for major cathedrals and shrine worlds. Pilgrim fleets acquired armed escorts that gradually evolved into dedicated warships. Missionary expeditions to frontier worlds brought with them protectors who were soldiers in all but name. By the early 36th millennium, the ecclesiarchy effectively controlled a military force that rivaled the imperial guard regiments of many sectors. These forces answered not to the Lord Commander Militant or the Imperial Navy, but to cardinals and ultimately to the ecclesiarch himself. The balance of power established after the Horus Heresy had been subtly but significantly altered. Into this environment of shifting power dynamics stepped Goge Vandire, a figure whose name would become synonymous with the Imperium's darkest hour of civil strife since the Horus Heresy itself. Vandire's early career offered little hint of the tyrant he would become. He began as a mid-level functionary within the Adeptus Administratum, the vast bureaucracy that managed the Imperium's resources, tithes, and logistics. What distinguished Vandire was not merely ambition, for the Imperium has never lacked ambitious men, but his extraordinary talent for political manipulation and his absolute ruthlessness in eliminating obstacles to his advancement. He understood the Byzantine structure of imperial governance better than any of his contemporaries, identifying its pressure points and vulnerabilities with surgical precision. Vandire's rise through the ranks of the administratum was methodical and relentless. He cultivated allies among influential noble houses, trading favors and information. He identified rivals and arranged for their disgrace or reassignment to distant, dangerous posts. Those who could not be removed by conventional means sometimes fell victim to unfortunate accidents or were found guilty of heretical sympathies after anonymous tips to the Inquisition. By the year 200 of the 36th millennium, Vandire had achieved the rank of Master of the Administratum, one of the High Lords of Terra. From this position, he could observe the other centers of power within the Senatorum Imperialis, planning his next move. The ecclesiarchy, with its vast wealth and growing military might, presented both the greatest threat to his ambitions and the greatest opportunity. The ecclesiarchy at this time was led by Ecclesiarch Paulius III, an elderly and increasingly senile figurehead. Real power within the Ministorum had devolved to a circle of cardinals who engaged in constant political maneuvering against each other. Vandire exploited these divisions masterfully, providing information to one faction that undermined another, offering administratum support to cardinals who aligned with his interests, and gradually positioning himself as an essential ally to the Ministorum's leadership. When Paulius III died, some whispered with Vandire's assistance, the College of Cardinals fell into deadlock over his successor. The leading candidates were all compromised by scandals that had mysteriously come to light during the previous months. As the deadlock continued, Vandire made his move. Using his authority as Master of the Administratum, he declared Ecclesiarch Paulius III's administration corrupt and initiated an investigation into the Ministorum's finances. This investigation, led by administratum officials loyal to Vandire, created a pretext for him to enter the ecclesiarchal palace with a contingent of Adepta Sororitas. Once inside, Vandire met with the ecclesiarch-elect, a compromise candidate named Benediction IV. What transpired during this meeting remains unclear, but when Vandire emerged, he claimed that Benediction had been revealed as a heretic and summarily executed. More significantly, Vandire now wore the ecclesiarch's robes and carried the rod of office. Through this audacious coup, Goge Vandire became both Master of the Administratum and Ecclesiarch of the Adeptus Ministorum, the first individual in Imperial history to hold two High Lord positions simultaneously. The remaining High Lords, who might have opposed this unprecedented concentration of power, found themselves unable to act effectively. The Fabricator General of Mars was preoccupied with a schism within the Mechanicus over the discovery of archaeotech on the fringes of the Ghoul stars. The Grand Provost Marshal of the Adeptus Sororitas had recently died under suspicious circumstances, and his successor was a career-minded administrator who owed his appointment to Vandire's influence. The Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes remained focused on the protection of the Emperor's physical form, continuing the Custodes' traditional reluctance to involve themselves in imperial politics. The Lord Commander Militant of the Imperial Guard might have posed a threat, but Vandire had foreseen this. Using his control of the Administratum, he had arranged for the deployment of key guard regiments to distant campaigns. The most loyal and capable generals found themselves fighting orcs in the Ultima Segmentum or suppressing rebellions in the Pacificus, too far from Terra to challenge Vandire's power grab. The Master of the Astronomicon, traditionally a counterweight to the Administratum, had become increasingly isolated as the psychic beacon's operation required more and more resources and psychers. Vandire had quietly restricted these resources in the years leading up to his coup, ensuring that the Master of the Astronomicon would be too focused on maintaining the beacon's function to engage in political resistance. With the High Lords effectively neutralized, Vandire consolidated his position. He appointed cardinals loyal to him to key positions throughout the ecclesiarchy. He redirected tithes from across the Imperium into accounts controlled by his supporters. He expanded the Fraterus Templar forces, creating what amounted to a personal army answerable only to him. Most ominously, Vandire began to reshape Imperial doctrine. The worship of the Emperor, always central to the Ministorum's teachings, now became explicitly linked with obedience to the ecclesiarchy, and by extension to Vandire himself. Questioning the ecclesiarch's decrees was declared heresy. Planetary governors who expressed concerns about increased tithes found their world subject to Ministorum investigations that often ended in their removal or execution. The early years of Vandire's reign were marked by a creeping expansion of authority rather than dramatic power grabs. He understood that the Imperium's vastness made sudden change impossible. Instead, he layered new requirements atop existing imperial structures. Additional tithes were designated as offerings to the Emperor's glory. New oaths of loyalty included pledges to uphold the ecclesiarch's authority. Administrative posts throughout the Imperium were gradually filled with individuals who owed their advancement to Vandire's patronage. As his confidence grew, so did Vandire's paranoia and cruelty. He began to see threats in even minor disagreements. Advisors who counseled caution or moderation disappeared. Public executions of heretics became common spectacles on Terra and other major worlds. The Fraterist Templar, now openly functioning as Vandire's enforcers, conducted purges of suspected dissidents throughout the Segmentum Solar. The mechanisms that might have checked Vandire's growing tyranny had been systematically dismantled or neutralized. The Inquisition, traditionally independent of the High Lord's authority, found itself infiltrated by Vandire's supporters. Inquisitors who investigated the ecclesiarchy's activities were denounced as heretics themselves, their authority undermined by carefully crafted rumors and false evidence. Even the Adepta Sororitas, the Emperor's space marines, were limited in their ability to respond. Scattered across the galaxy and focused on external threats, many chapters were simply unaware of the extent of Vandire's corruption. Those who did recognize the danger were hesitant to move against an officially sanctioned imperial authority, mindful of the lessons of the Horus Heresy and wary of triggering another civil war. By the mid-36th millennium, the stage was set for the full horror of the Age of Apostasy. Goge Vandire, now commonly referred to as Ecclesiarch Vandire, despite his dual role, had accumulated more personal power than any individual since the Primarchs of the Great Crusade era. The Imperium's carefully balanced governance had been subverted. The institutions designed to prevent tyranny had been compromised. Yet even as Vandire's reign of blood and madness intensified, the seeds of resistance were being sown. On distant worlds beyond his immediate reach, Space Marine chapters observed the deteriorating situation with growing concern. Within the Inquisition, uncorrupted agents began to form hidden networks of resistance. And on the shrine world of San Lear, a humble preacher named Sebastian Thor began to speak out against the corruption that had infected the ecclesiarchy, his words carrying an authority that would eventually challenge Vandire's bloody reign. Goge Vandire's ascension to unprecedented power began with careful calculation rather than brute force. As master of the Administratum, he already possessed intimate knowledge of the Imperium's bureaucratic machinery, its weaknesses, its pressure points, and most importantly, the individuals who could be manipulated to serve his ambitions. The Administratum's vast network of information gatherers had provided him with compromising details on virtually every high-ranking Imperial official, knowledge he wielded like a scalpel to remove obstacles and silence opposition. The position of Ecclesiarch became vacant in the year 200, following the death of Paulius III. The College of Cardinals, responsible for selecting a successor, found themselves deadlocked in bitter dispute. Vandire recognized this moment of institutional weakness and struck. Using his authority as master of the Administratum, he ordered an emergency audit of ecclesiarchal finances, citing concerns about misappropriation of imperial tithes. This manufactured crisis gave him legitimate reason to enter the ecclesiarchal palace with a contingent of Arbite's enforcers. Upon entering the sacred halls of the Ministorum's headquarters, Vandire confronted Ecclesiarch-elect Benediction IV. What transpired behind closed doors remains a matter of historical debate, but contemporary accounts suggest Vandire presented the cardinal with evidence of financial impropriety, evidence almost certainly fabricated by Administratum officials loyal to Vandire. When Benediction refused to step aside, Vandire had him executed for heresy against the God Emperor's tithe. In the confusion that followed, Vandire simply claimed the ecclesiarch's rod of office for himself. The cardinals, many already compromised by Vandire's blackmail operations, found themselves unable to mount effective opposition. Those few who spoke against him disappeared within days, their fate serving as warning to others who might challenge his authority. Thus, through political maneuvering and calculated violence rather than open warfare, Goge Vandire became the only individual in Imperial history to simultaneously hold two High Lord positions, Master of the Administratum and Ecclesiarch of the Adeptus Ministorum. With these twin pillars of power, he controlled both the Imperium's material resources and its spiritual authority. The remaining High Lords of Terra, who might have checked Vandire's power, found themselves systematically neutralized. The Lord Commander Militant discovered his most loyal regiments deployed to distant war zones. The Fabricator General of Mars became embroiled in a mechanic schism that Vandire had quietly encouraged through Administratum intelligence operatives. The Grand Provost Marshal of the Arbites had been replaced by a Vandire loyalist following his predecessor's accidental death. Vandire's consolidation of power extended beyond Terra. He dispatched cardinals loyal to him to major shrine worlds across the Imperium, replacing local ecclesiarchy leadership. The Administratum's control of interstellar communication allowed him to isolate potential centers of resistance, ensuring that planetary governors and sector lords received only the information Vandire wanted them to have. Among Vandire's most significant early actions was his journey to the shrine world of San Lear in the 201st year of the 36th millennium. This world housed the Order of the Daughters of the Emperor, a sect of female warriors dedicated to the protection of ecclesiarchy sites and officials. The Daughters had developed in isolation from much of imperial politics, focused entirely on their sacred duty and martial training. When Vandire arrived on San Lear with his entourage, the Daughters were initially suspicious of his claims to ecclesiarchal authority. Their leader, according to historical accounts, demanded proof of his divine mandate. Vandire, ever the opportunist, orchestrated a dramatic demonstration. He ordered one of his personal guards to fire Allah's weapon at him at point-blank range. The shot, which should have killed him instantly, was deflected by the conversion field built into his ornate robes, a piece of archaeotech whose function was unknown to the isolated Daughters. To the Daughters of the Emperor, this appeared to be a miraculous intervention by the God Emperor himself, protecting his chosen representative. Vandire had not performed a miracle, but had merely exploited the Daughters' technological ignorance. This deception proved devastatingly effective. The entire order pledged their unwavering loyalty to Vandire, becoming the brides of the Emperor, his personal bodyguard and enforcement arm. The brides of the Emperor represented a significant military asset for Vandire. Unlike the Fraterus Templar, whose legal status as an ecclesiarchal military force was questionable under imperial law, the brides were technically not men under arms, and thus did not violate the ancient prohibitions against the ecclesiarchy maintaining military forces. This legal technicality would later prove important in the reforms that followed Vandire's reign, leading to the formation of the Adepta Sororitas. With his personal protection assured and the mechanisms of imperial governance firmly under his control, Vandire began the period historians would later name the Reign of Blood. This phase of his rule, lasting approximately 70 years, saw the implementation of increasingly oppressive policies across the Imperium. The first victims of Vandire's tyranny were those closest to him. High-ranking officials in both the Administratum and Ecclesiarchy, who showed even slight hesitation in following his directives, were publicly executed as examples. These purges accelerated as Vandire's paranoia grew, eventually reaching the point where entire departments within the imperial bureaucracy were decimated on mere suspicion of disloyalty. Beyond Terra, Vandire's policies manifested in crushing new tithes imposed on imperial worlds. These extractions went far beyond traditional imperial taxation, demanding not just material resources, but increasingly large numbers of citizens for penitent service. Millions were taken from their homes to labor on massive cathedral construction projects, or to serve as personal servants to ecclesiarchy officials. Those who resisted these demands faced brutal suppression. Worlds that failed to meet Vandire's tithe requirements suffered consequences ranging from punitive additional taxation to outright planetary purges. The hive world of Galonus IV, which fell behind on its tithe payments due to a devastating plague, saw its entire ruling class publicly executed by the Fraterus Templar. The agri-world of Tabor, whose harvests had failed for 3 consecutive years, was subjected to exterminatus on Vandire's direct order, its population of over 8 billion souls declared wasteful of the Emperor's resources. These extreme measures were justified through increasingly twisted interpretations of Imperial doctrine. Vandire's theologians produced new religious texts declaring suffering to be the natural state of humanity, with increased hardship presented as a form of spiritual purification. Compliance with Vandire's demands, no matter how unreasonable, was equated with devotion to the Emperor himself. The Adepta Sororitas, traditionally independent of ecclesiarchal authority, found themselves targeted by Vandire's propaganda. Space Marine chapters that questioned the legitimacy of his rule were denounced as traitors. The Celestial Lions chapter, which openly criticized the excessive tithes imposed on worlds in their protectorate, saw their recruiting worlds placed under ecclesiarchal interdict, cutting off their supply of new aspirants. The Fire Hawks, who refused to participate in punitive actions against civilian populations, found their requests for munitions and equipment from Forge worlds mysteriously delayed or denied. As years stretched into decades, Vandire's mental state deteriorated markedly. His paranoia reached levels that impaired rational governance. He began to see assassination attempts in mundane events. A servant dropping a tray might be executed for attempting to distract him from noticing a hidden attacker. He ordered the construction of increasingly elaborate security measures within his personal quarters, including a maze of false passages designed to confuse would-be assassins. Vandire's religious proclamations grew more bizarre and contradictory. He declared himself the Emperor's only true voice, then weeks later claimed to be in direct communion with the Emperor, receiving new revelations that conveniently supported his latest policies. He instituted mandatory daily prayer sessions throughout the ecclesiarchal palace, then had participants executed for praying incorrectly, according to criteria that changed without notice. The brides of the Emperor, still deceived by Vandire's false miracle, enforced his increasingly erratic commands without question. Their unquestioning loyalty made them perfect instruments of terror. Clad in ornate power armor and wielding power weapons that could slice through ordinary defenses, they became feared throughout the Segmentum Solar. A single bride could execute a planetary governor with impunity, secure in the knowledge that her actions carried the full weight of ecclesiarchal authority. By the year 230 of the 36th millennium, approximately 30 years into Vandire's reign, the first organized resistance began to emerge. On distant worlds, particularly in the Segmentum Pacificus and Segmentum Tempestus, planetary governors and local ecclesiarchy officials began to quietly withhold tithes, claiming warp storms or Xenos attacks had reduced their capacity to contribute. These isolated acts of defiance, while not coordinated, represented the first cracks in Vandire's absolute authority. More significant resistance came from within the Inquisition. Though Vandire had managed to compromise many inquisitors through blackmail or corruption, the fundamental independence of the Inquisition meant that many of its members operated beyond his immediate reach. Inquisitor Marcius Osrin of the Ordo Hereticus began a covert investigation into the legitimacy of Vandire's religious authority, gathering evidence of his doctrinal distortions and abuse of office. The Space Marine chapters, though initially hesitant to interfere in what appeared to be internal Imperial politics, grew increasingly concerned as reports of Vandire's excesses reached them. The Adepta Sororitas had been created to protect humanity, and the systematic suffering inflicted by Vandire's policies ran counter to this fundamental purpose. Chapter masters began to meet in secret conclaves, discussing the appropriate response to what many now viewed as a threat to the Imperium's survival. As his reign entered its 5th decade, Vandire's mental deterioration accelerated dramatically. He began to experience vivid hallucinations, claiming to see the Emperor standing beside him during public appearances. His sleep patterns collapsed entirely. Palace staff reported that he would remain awake for days at a time, poring over ancient texts or interrogating prisoners personally. During these sleepless periods, his decision-making became even more erratic and cruel. One particularly notorious incident occurred in 267, when Vandire ordered the execution of every person on Terra whose name began with the letters. A purge that would have killed billions, had his subordinates not quietly modified the implementation of the order to target only a few hundred unfortunate individuals whose names were brought specifically to Vandire's attention. The brides of the Emperor, despite their unwavering loyalty, were not immune to Vandire's growing madness. He subjected them to increasingly bizarre tests of faith, including ordering them to fast for weeks at a time or to fight each other to the death to prove their devotion. Those who survived these ordeals became even more fanatically loyal, their psychological conditioning reinforced by the extreme experiences Vandire forced upon them. By the year 270 of the 36th millennium, approximately 70 years after Vandire's initial power grab, the Imperium had been pushed to the breaking point. Entire sectors had stopped responding to Terra's demands, effectively seceding in all but name. The military readiness of the Imperium had been severely compromised by Vandire's prioritization of cathedral construction over weapons manufacturing and his execution of experienced military leaders on spurious charges of disloyalty. As Vandire's grip on sanity continued to slip, the Imperium began to fracture along geographical, political, and ideological lines. What had begun as isolated acts of defiance evolved into organized resistance and ultimately open secession as the 36th millennium approached its final centuries. The first major break came from the Segmentum Pacificus in 272. Lord Commander Galvanus, the Imperial commander overseeing the Segmentum's military forces, issued the Declaration of Autonomy after receiving orders to execute 1/10 of his officer corps for alleged spiritual impurity. Rather than comply with what he considered a suicidal directive that would cripple the Segmentum's defenses against ongoing Orc incursions, Galvanus severed official communications with Terra. The declaration carefully avoided terms like secession or independence, instead framing the action as a temporary measure to preserve the Emperor's realm during a period of administrative confusion. This political maneuvering allowed Galvanus to maintain the fiction of imperial loyalty while effectively establishing autonomous governance for nearly a fifth of the Imperium's territory. Within months, the Segmentum Pacificus Administratum, under Lord High Administrator Melchior Terros, redirected all tithes and resources to local defense and infrastructure. Terros established the Regency Council of the Pacificus, which claimed to rule in the Emperor's name while rejecting Vandire's authority specifically. The council included representatives from major Forge worlds, prominent noble houses, and even some members of the local ecclesiarchy who had grown disillusioned with Vandire's increasingly heretical pronouncements. Vandire's response to this challenge was hampered by the vast distances involved and the deteriorating state of warp travel. His order to dispatch a punitive fleet to bring the traitors to compliance could not be effectively implemented. The Imperial Navy, already stretched thin by ongoing conflicts with Xeno's forces and the need to maintain shipping lanes for vital resources, found itself unable to assemble a fleet of sufficient strength to threaten the Pacificus forces. More critically, many naval officers harbored their own doubts about Vandire's legitimacy. Fleet Admiral Lansung of Battlefleet Gothic quietly refused to commit his ships to what he viewed as a civil war, citing ongoing defensive requirements against Dark Eldar raiders. Similar excuses emerged from fleet commanders throughout the Imperium, creating a pattern of passive resistance that effectively neutralized Vandire's ability to project military power beyond the Segmentum Solar. The Imperial Guard faced similar fragmentation. Regimental commanders found themselves forced to choose between conflicting loyalties, to their homeworlds, to their immediate superiors, to the Imperial Guard command structure, or to the increasingly erratic directives coming from Terra. This crisis of command led to a breakdown in the Guard's cohesion as a unified fighting force. On Cadia, the fortress world guarding the Eye of Terror, Lord Castellan Isadin made the pragmatic decision to focus exclusively on the chaos threat, effectively isolating the Cadian Gate from Terran politics. He issued the Cadian Edict, which declared that all Guard regiments within the Cadian system would answer only to the Cadian High Command until Imperial authority is properly restored. While technically an act of insubordination, Isadin's focus on defending against chaos incursions made it impossible for even Vandire's loyalists to label him a traitor. Similar declarations of limited autonomy spread throughout the Imperial Guard command structure. The Mordian Iron Guard ceased responding to non-local deployment orders. The Catachan jungle fighters, already notoriously independent, simply disappeared into the dense forests of their homeworld when ecclesiarchal representatives arrived to enforce new tithe demands. The Vestroyan Firstborn continued their tradition of sending regiments to the Imperial Guard, but quietly redirected them to serve alongside Space Marine chapters rather than under commanders loyal to Vandire. This disintegration of centralized military command created a patchwork of defensive arrangements across the Imperium. Some sectors maintained strong defensive postures, particularly those with established threats on their borders. Others found themselves increasingly vulnerable as military assets were withdrawn by commanders seeking to protect their own interests or homeworlds. The Adepta Sororitas, whose response would prove crucial to the Imperium's fate, adopted a position of strategic neutrality during the early years of the Imperial fragmentation. The chapter masters, mindful of the catastrophic consequences of the Horus Heresy, were deeply reluctant to involve themselves in what appeared to be an internal political struggle. The memories of brother fighting brother during that ancient civil war remained a powerful deterrent to direct intervention. Instead, most Space Marine chapters withdrew to their fortress monasteries and recruiting worlds, focusing on defending their own territories and maintaining their combat readiness. The Ultramarines, controlling the mini-empire of Ultramar in the eastern fringe, effectively sealed their borders while continuing to protect the surrounding sectors from Xeno's threats. Chapter Master Ignacio made it clear that while the Ultramarines would not oppose Vandire directly, neither would they enforce his edicts within their sphere of influence. The Imperial Fists, traditionally among the most loyal to Terra itself, found themselves in a particularly difficult position. Their fortress monastery on Terra placed them in proximity to Vandire's power base, yet their traditions demanded loyalty to the Emperor and the Imperium as institutions rather than to any individual leader. Chapter Master Ambrosian chose a middle path, withdrawing most of his forces to the Phalanx, the chapter's massive orbital fortress, while maintaining a minimal ceremonial presence at the Imperial Palace. This careful positioning allowed the Imperial Fists to monitor the situation without becoming entangled in Vandire's increasingly paranoid security apparatus. Other chapters made similar calculations based on their particular circumstances and traditions. The Dark Angels intensified their secretive hunt for the Fallen, using the general confusion as cover for operations that might otherwise have attracted unwanted attention. The Space Wolves withdrew to Fenris, but maintained extensive intelligence networks through their Wolfblade units stationed with navigator houses. The Raven Guard utilized their expertise in covert operations to evacuate key Imperial officials targeted by Vandire's purges, establishing a network of safe havens in remote locations. This withdrawal of Space Marine support from the broader Imperial structure created further governance challenges. Many planetary systems had come to rely on periodic Astartes' presence as a deterrent against rebellion or Xeno's incursion. Without this stabilizing influence, local authorities were forced to commit more resources to security, often at the expense of production capacity and tithe fulfillment. As traditional Imperial authority weakened, the vacuum created opportunities for various cults, heresies, and rebellions to emerge. The most dangerous of these were chaos cults, which flourished in the atmosphere of desperation and uncertainty. On hive worlds like Necromunda and Scintilla, underhive gangs previously content with territorial disputes evolved into full-fledged chaos cults, offering salvation from Vandire's oppressive tithes and increasingly bizarre religious requirements. The Pilgrims of Hate, a Nurgle worshipping cult that had previously operated only in the shadows, emerged into open activity on over 30 worlds in the Segmentum Obscurus. They presented themselves as healers and providers, offering food and medical care to populations suffering under increased tithe demands. Behind this benevolent facade, they spread plagues engineered to appear natural, while initiating converts into deeper Nurgle worship. The Brotherhood of the Horned Darkness, dedicated to Tzinch, infiltrated administrative structures on worlds where Imperial authority had weakened. They specialized in replacing local officials with cultists or mind-controlled puppets, gradually shifting planetary governance toward chaos worship while maintaining a facade of Imperial loyalty. Their subtle approach allowed them to corrupt entire planetary governments before anyone recognized the threat. Slaaneshi cults found fertile ground in the decadence of noble houses seeking escape from the grim realities of Imperial collapse. The Sensates of the Seventh Bliss established pleasure cults that spread from the nobility to the wider population, promising transcendent experiences to distract from material deprivation. Their practices gradually evolved from mere hedonism to full ritual worship of Slaanesh, creating a generation of nobles whose decisions were influenced by demonic whispers. Khornate cults emerged most prominently in areas experiencing direct conflict. The Gorewolves of Kelthar began as a militia formed to protect mining communities from increased ecclesiarchal taxation, but their resistance gradually transformed into bloodthirsty worship of Khorne as they achieved military successes against Fraterus Templar forces. Their example inspired similar groups across contested territories, creating a feedback loop of violence that served Khorne's purposes regardless of which side prevailed in any given conflict. Beyond chaos influences, numerous indigenous rebellions erupted across the Imperium. These movements typically focused on local grievances rather than ideological opposition to Imperial rule itself. On Tanith, forest clans rose against ecclesiarchal missionaries attempting to clear sacred woodlands for cathedral construction. The population of Valhalla rioted when increased tithes threatened their carefully maintained heating systems, essential for survival on their ice-covered world. Vestroya's ruling families temporarily seized control of their forge complexes when Vandire's representatives demanded they double production quotas while reducing resource allocations. More organized resistance came from resurgent human philosophies and belief systems that predated the Imperial creed. The Logos Historica Verita, an underground scholarly movement dedicated to preserving accurate historical knowledge, gained significant support among educated Imperial citizens disillusioned by the ecclesiarchy's increasingly distorted portrayal of Imperial history. Though not military in nature, their distribution of texts challenging Vandire's theological innovations undermined his ideological control. The Revivalists of the Emperor's Light, a sect that claimed to follow the original Imperial truth of the Great Crusade era, established communes on frontier worlds where they practiced a non-deifying form of emperor reverence focused on his human achievements rather than divine status. While technically heretical even before Vandire's rise, their communities grew substantially during this period as refugees sought alternatives to Vandire's oppressive interpretation of the Imperial creed. The Imperium's fragmentation was further accelerated by the deterioration of interstellar communications. Astropathic choirs, already strained by warp disturbances that had been increasing since the early 36th millennium, found themselves subject to Vandire's interference. He established the Office of Spiritual Purity in Astropathic Communication, which monitored and censored messages between worlds. This additional layer of control further delayed critical communications and introduced distortions, as messages were altered to conform with Vandire's preferred narratives. Navigator houses, essential for warp travel, adopted increasingly cautious policies. Many restricted their services to established trade routes and military operations they deemed essential for human survival, refusing assignments that appeared to serve Vandire's personal agenda rather than the Imperium's fundamental needs. The House of Belisarius went further, recalling all its navigators from ships controlled by known Vandire loyalists, effectively grounding significant portions of Battlefleet Solar. Approximately 75 years into Vandire's reign, the Imperium existed more as a concept than a functioning political entity. While most worlds and sectors still acknowledged the Emperor's ultimate authority, practical governance had devolved to local and regional powers. The elaborate administrative structures that had maintained imperial cohesion for millennia continued to exist in form, but had lost much of their practical function. The fracturing of imperial unity during the Age of Apostasy extended beyond political and military dimensions, striking at the technological heart of the Imperium itself. The Adeptus Mechanicus, whose forge worlds formed the industrial backbone of humanity's domain, found their ancient traditions and carefully maintained hierarchies challenged by the chaos engulfing the wider Imperium. Unlike other imperial institutions, the Mechanicus had always maintained a degree of autonomy from Terra, their allegiance secured through the ancient Treaty of Mars rather than direct subordination. This arrangement had preserved technological production through countless political upheavals, but Vandire's unprecedented concentration of power threatened even this long-standing independence. The first signs of division appeared when Fabricator General Gastaf Hediatrix received Vandire's demands for increased production of ornate religious artifacts and cathedral components at the expense of military materiel. Hediatrix, a pragmatist who had navigated Mechanicus politics for over 2 centuries, initially attempted to accommodate these requests while maintaining essential weapons production. This delicate balancing act became increasingly untenable as Vandire's demands grew more excessive and his punishment of perceived slights more severe. When Vandire executed 3 Mechanicus representatives on Terra for insufficient enthusiasm in implementing his production directives, Hediatrix called an emergency conclave of the Martian Parliament. The gathering of Archmagi and Forge Lords reached no consensus, instead splintering along lines that would define the coming Mechanicus civil conflict. The most significant division emerged between Mars itself and the Forge world of Moiri in the Segmentum Pacificus. Archmagos Dracovac of Moiri had long advocated an interpretation of the Omnissiah's nature that deviated from Martian orthodoxy. The Moiri doctrine held that the machine god manifested through patterns in data and energy, rather than in physical machinery alone, and that these patterns could be discerned through careful analysis of technological function across time. More controversially, Dracovac and his followers claimed their calculations proved the Emperor and the Omnissiah were not merely aligned entities, but truly one being in different aspects. This theological position had been tolerated as a minor deviation for centuries, but in the context of Vandire's religious reforms, it suddenly gained political significance. Dracovac seized the moment to broadcast the Moiri computations to all Forge worlds, complex mathematical proofs purporting to demonstrate that Vandire's edicts contradicted the Emperor Omnissiah's will as revealed through technological patterns. According to these calculations, the diversion of resources to cathedral construction represented a severe deviation from the Omnissiah's optimal path for human development. Mars officially denounced the Moiri computations as corrupted data and demanded Dracovac's submission to Mechanicus authority. Instead, Dracovac declared Mars itself compromised by Vandire's influence and called on all Forge worlds to recognize Moiri's interpretation as the true path of the machine god. Within months, the Mechanicus had split into 3 broad factions. The Martian Orthodoxy, led by Fabricator General Hediatrix, maintained nominal allegiance to Terra while attempting to preserve traditional Mechanicus independence. They continued limited compliance with Vandire's demands while secretly redirecting resources to maintain military production. Their position was strongest in the Segmentum Solar and parts of Segmentum Tempestus, where proximity to Terra made open defiance dangerous. The Moiri techno-revisionists, under Archmagos Dracovac, rejected both Vandire's authority and Mars compromises. They established an alternative Mechanicus hierarchy centered on Moiri, with affiliated Forge worlds throughout Segmentum Pacificus and portions of Segmentum Ultima. Their theological innovations attracted tech priests seeking both spiritual and practical justifications for opposing Vandire's demands. The Isolationist Conclave, a loose confederation of Forge worlds primarily in Segmentum Obscurus and the Galactic North, chose neither side in the theological dispute. Instead, Forge worlds like Styges 8 and Graea severed most external communications and focused on self-sufficiency, building up their defenses and hoarding resources against future threats. Their pragmatic approach appealed to tech priests concerned primarily with survival during a period of unprecedented instability. This three-way division had immediate practical consequences for Imperial technology. The standardized SDCs that had maintained technological consistency across the Imperium for millennia became subject to divergent interpretations and modifications. Martian Orthodox tech priests continued traditional patterns, but were forced to make compromises due to resource limitations. Moiri adherents incorporated their computational theology into design modifications, creating variant weapons and vehicles that reflected their understanding of the Omnissiah's patterns. Isolationist Forge worlds often reverted to older, more reliable designs that could be produced with locally available materials. The fragmentation of Mechanicus authority accelerated the technological regression that had been gradually occurring since the Dark Age of technology. Without consistent oversight and quality control, subtle deviations in manufacturing processes accumulated across generations of production. Weapons produced on Mars might use slightly different ammunition specifications than those from Ryza or Lucius, creating logistical nightmares for Imperial forces that drew equipment from multiple sources. More seriously, the schism disrupted the already limited sharing of technological discoveries between Forge worlds. The Moiri faction discovered improved plasma containment techniques, but refused to share them with Mars-aligned worlds. Styges 8 developed enhanced Auspex arrays that could have benefited Imperial Navy vessels throughout the Imperium, but restricted the technology to their immediate allies. Mars itself hoarded several breakthrough technologies in gravitational manipulation, using them as leverage to maintain the loyalty of wavering Forge worlds. The hoarding of archaeotech, rare artifacts from humanity's technological golden age, became particularly problematic. Tech priests from all factions began recovering and concealing such treasures, rather than registering them with their superiors as required by Mechanicus doctrine. Entire expeditions to recover Dark Age technology from abandoned human colonies or space hulks went unrecorded, their findings disappearing into hidden vaults and private collections. On Ganymede, a Jovian moon in the Sol system, Magos explorator Hieronymus Tesla discovered a cache of neurosymphonic interfaces dating to the Dark Age of technology. Rather than surrendering these priceless artifacts to Mars as required, Tesla and his exploration team vanished into the outer reaches of the solar system, eventually establishing a secret research outpost in the Kuiper Belt. Similar incidents occurred throughout the Imperium, with tech priests choosing personal advancement or factional advantage over collective knowledge preservation. The practical consequences for the Imperium's military capabilities were severe and far-reaching. The production of Leman Russ battle tanks, the backbone of Imperial Guard armored divisions, fell by nearly 40% within 5 years of the schism's beginning. Different Forge worlds produced variant models with incompatible components, making field repairs increasingly difficult and reducing operational readiness across multiple war zones. Lasgun production maintained higher volumes but suffered from quality control issues. Weapons manufactured on Moiri aligned Forge worlds used focusing crystals cut according to patterns derived from their computational theology, resulting in higher energy output but reduced reliability and increased power consumption. Mars pattern lasguns remained more consistent but could not be produced in sufficient quantities to meet demand across all Imperial forces. The most critical shortages affected void warfare capabilities. The construction of new Imperial Navy vessels virtually ceased outside a few key shipyards. The Mars orbital shipyards continued producing ships, but at less than 20% of their pre-schism capacity. The great shipyards of Hydrafor and Cypra Mundi maintained higher production rates but focused on smaller escort vessels rather than capital ships, as these required fewer rare components and could be completed more quickly. The mighty Retribution-class battleships, whose construction had once been the pride of Imperial shipbuilding, became almost impossible to maintain properly, let alone build anew. Each required specific components from multiple forge worlds, many of which were now aligned with different Mechanicus factions. The battleship Eternal Vigilance, damaged during conflict with Dark Eldar raiders in the Gothic sector, remained in dry dock for 17 years due to the unavailability of replacement parts for its main drive systems. Even the fearsome Titans of the Collegia Titanica were affected by the schism. Titan legions traditionally maintained close ties to their parent forge worlds, and as these worlds chose different sides in the conflict, so too did their associated Titan legions. The Legio Ignatum remained loyal to Mars, while the Legio Vulcanum declared for Moiri. Other Titan legions chose isolation, establishing fortified positions on frontier worlds and refusing deployment orders from any faction. The maintenance of existing Titans became increasingly problematic as specialized components became unavailable. Tech priests resorted to adapting parts from other war machines or even fabricating replacements using inferior methods. The Warlord-class Titan Invictus Rex, pride of Legio Astorum, was reduced to deploying with one-arm weapon system permanently offline due to irreplaceable damage to its power distribution network. For Space Marine chapters, who relied on the Mechanicus for the maintenance of their most advanced equipment, the schism forced difficult choices. Many chapters established closer relationships with specific forge worlds aligned with their strategic interests, trading combat support for preferential access to technical expertise and equipment. The Iron Hands, with their close historical ties to the Mechanicus, found themselves particularly torn by these developments, with different companies developing relationships with different Mechanicus factions. The production and maintenance of power armor suffered significant disruption. Mark VII Aquila armor, the standard pattern for most chapters, required components from forge worlds that now found themselves in different Mechanicus factions. Chapters increasingly resorted to cannibalizing damaged suits to maintain operational ones, a practice that would have been considered near heretical in more stable times. The specialized equipment of the Adepta Sororitas faced even greater challenges. The plasma weapons utilized by many chapters required specific focusing, arrays produced only on certain forge worlds. Terminator armor, already rare and irreplaceable, became even more precious as the technical knowledge to repair damaged suits became concentrated in fewer and fewer locations. Dreadnought sarcophagi, the life support systems that sustained grievously wounded Space Marines, suffered from maintenance issues that sometimes forced chapters to perform the Emperor's mercy on brothers who might otherwise have continued to serve. The effects extended beyond military technology to civilian infrastructure. The Great Hive cities, dependent on ancient environmental systems and power generators, faced increasing failures as replacement parts became unavailable. On Necromunda, 3 entire hive spires were abandoned when their air filtration systems failed beyond repair, forcing massive population relocations and resulting social unrest. Similar situations occurred across densely populated worlds throughout the Imperium. Agricultural worlds dependent on complex irrigation and soil management technology saw crop yields decline as systems degraded without proper maintenance. Food shortages became common even on worlds that had previously exported agricultural products, contributing to malnutrition and increased susceptibility to disease among civilian populations. These conditions further reduced industrial productivity, creating a downward spiral of scarcity and inefficiency. Medical technology, already limited compared to the heights of the Dark Age, regressed further. Augmetic replacements for injured Imperial servants became cruder and less functional. Sophisticated life support systems that had once been standard in major Imperial hospitals became restricted to the highest-ranking officials. Common citizens made do with increasingly primitive care, relying more on folk remedies and the dubious ministrations of underground medici operating with salvaged equipment. The disruption of supply lines compounded these technological issues. Even when a forge world could produce needed components or equipment, transporting them to where they were needed became increasingly difficult. Warp storms, always a hazard for Imperial shipping, grew more frequent and severe during this period, possibly reflecting the psychic impact of widespread human suffering and conflict. Navigator houses, already cautious about supporting Vandire's regime, became even more selective about which shipping routes they would serve. Priority went to voyages supporting basic human survival needs rather than military campaigns or political objectives. This practical approach further limited the Imperium's ability to respond coherently to external threats, as reinforcements and supplies often arrived too late to be effective. The world of Dimammer had never been remarkable by Imperial standards. A temperate agri-world in the Segmentum Obscurus, it produced adequate tithes of grain and maintained modest PDF forces sufficient to deter minor raids, but little else. Its single continent was dotted with farming communities and small administrative centers, with the planetary capital of Thoska serving as the only settlement large enough to be called a city. The planet's most distinctive feature was its unusually stable weather patterns, which allowed for predictable harvests year after year, a rarity in the often turbulent climates of human-settled worlds. It was on this unremarkable world, in the small farming community of Heidelberg, that Sebastian Thor was born in the 235th year of the 36th millennium. The son of a grain farmer and a local medici, Thor's early life gave no indication of his future significance. He received basic education in the Imperial Creed from the local ecclesiarchy shrine, supplemented by his mother's knowledge of practical medicine and his father's instruction in agriculture. The first signs of Thor's exceptional qualities emerged during his adolescence, when Dimammer experienced a rare drought that threatened the planet's harvests. While planetary authorities demanded full tithes despite the reduced yields, Thor organized local farmers to create communal storage and distribution systems that ensured no one in Heidelberg starved. His natural eloquence and organizational abilities allowed him to mediate disputes and maintain community cohesion during this crisis. By his 20th year, Thor had become a respected voice in regional agricultural councils, where his practical solutions to resource allocation problems earned him a reputation for wisdom beyond his years. His involvement with the ecclesiarchy remained minimal during this period. He attended required services, but showed no particular religious zeal or ambition for clerical office. This changed dramatically in 256, when ecclesiarchal representatives arrived on Dimammer to implement Vandire's latest edicts. These included increased tithes specifically earmarked for cathedral construction on distant worlds and the conscription of 1/10 of the population for penitent service in Vandire's projects. For an agri-world already struggling with inconsistent harvests, these demands threatened catastrophic food shortages. The planetary governor, Lucius Marican, prepared to comply with these edicts despite their ruinous implications. It was at the public announcement ceremony in Thoska that Thor first stepped onto the wider Imperial stage. Attending as a representative of his agricultural district, Thor stood when the governor called for questions and delivered what would later be known as the Address of Truth. Thor's speech challenged not the authority of the ecclesiarchy or the concept of imperial tithes, but rather the specific implementations being demanded. He methodically outlined how the proposed extractions would lead to starvation, reduced future production capacity, and ultimately a complete collapse of Dimammer's ability to serve the Emperor through its agricultural output. He contrasted these outcomes with the Emperor's known concern for humanity's survival and questioned whether directives that ensured suffering, rather than sustainability, could truly represent the master of mankind's will. What made Thor's address remarkable was not merely its content, but its delivery and reception. Witnesses described his words as carrying unusual weight and conviction, seeming to resonate with truth in a way that transcended ordinary rhetoric. Even the ecclesiarchal representatives, who had arrived prepared to dismiss any opposition, found themselves unable to effectively counter his arguments. The immediate aftermath of Thor's speech was modest but significant. The planetary governor negotiated a reduction in the tithe requirements, and the conscription quotas were adjusted to focus on volunteers rather than forced levies. Thor returned to his community with an enhanced reputation, but no formal change in status. Over the following months, however, recordings and transcripts of Thor's address spread to neighboring systems. In an Imperium increasingly starved for rational discourse and compassionate leadership, his words found receptive audiences far beyond Dimemmer. Agricultural worlds facing similar demands began citing the Dimemmer Compromise in their own negotiations with ecclesiarchal authorities. Thor himself initially seemed reluctant to embrace a wider role, continuing his work in agricultural administration and speaking publicly only when directly confronted with issues affecting his community. This changed in 258, when he experienced what his followers would later call the First Vision. While meditating in Dimemmer's modest planetary cathedral, Thor reportedly experienced a direct communication from the Emperor himself. Unlike Vandire's claims of divine guidance, which were accompanied by grandiose declarations and public displays, Thor spoke of this experience only to his closest associates. He described not a voice or image, but an overwhelming certainty about the Emperor's true intentions for humanity, protection, sustainable progress, and unity in the face of galactic threats. Whether this experience represented genuine psychic contact with the Emperor's consciousness on the Golden Throne, as Thor's followers believed, or simply a profound psychological insight, its effect on Thor was transformative. He began to speak more widely and directly about the contradictions between Vandire's edicts and the Emperor's true purpose for the Imperium. Thor's early sermons, delivered in market squares and community halls across Dimemmer, focused on practical interpretations of Imperial doctrine. He emphasized passages from the Lectitio Divinitatis that highlighted the Emperor's role as protector and guide, rather than distant tyrant. He contrasted the functional, community-supporting role of the pre-Vandire ecclesiarchy with the extractive and punitive approach that had developed under the Reign of Blood. What distinguished Thor's preaching from mere political opposition was his consistent affirmation of the Emperor's divinity and the legitimate role of the ecclesiarchy in imperial governance. He presented himself not as a revolutionary, but as a reformer, seeking to restore the Ministorum to its proper function rather than dismantle it. This theological positioning made it difficult for Vandire's supporters to dismiss him as simply another heretic or traitor. As Thor's influence spread beyond Dimemmer to neighboring agricultural worlds, he began to attract followers from more diverse backgrounds. Former Imperial administrators disillusioned with Vandire's governance, Ministorum priests who had been sidelined for questioning excessive tithes, even some members of the planetary defense forces who recognized that Vandire's policies were weakening rather than strengthening humanity's position. These early adherents formed the nucleus of what would become the Confederation of Light, initially an informal network of like-minded individuals sharing Thor's sermons and organizing community support systems. The Confederation gradually developed more structured operations. They established secure Vox networks for communication between worlds, organized distribution systems for essential supplies that bypassed official channels, and created safe houses for individuals targeted by Vandire's enforcers. The first major test of this nascent organization came in the year 260 of the 36th millennium, when a Fraterist Templar detachment arrived on Dimemmer with orders to arrest Thor for heretical preaching. Warned of their approach, Thor could have fled to a neighboring system where his support was growing. Instead, he chose to meet the Fraterist forces openly in Thoska's central plaza, surrounded by unarmed supporters. What happened next would be recounted as the miracle of the reign by Thor's followers. As the Fraterist commander read the charges against Thor, witnesses reported that the clear sky suddenly darkened. A torrential downpour began, so intense that it rendered the Fraterist flame weapons unusable and reduced visibility to mere meters. By the time the storm cleared, Thor and his closest supporters had vanished, seemingly without trace despite the Fraterist cordon surrounding the plaza. Meteorological records later confirmed that no storm had been forecast and that the precipitation patterns observed were unprecedented in Dimemmer's recorded history. Skeptics attributed the event to coincidence or exaggeration, but for many witnesses, it represented tangible evidence of divine favor. Thor reappeared 3 weeks later on Kairos, a shrine world 2 systems distant from Dimammer. How he traversed this distance without being detected by Vandire's forces remains unexplained in historical records. Some accounts suggest assistance from rogue elements within the Navigator houses, while others imply the involvement of inquisitorial agents already moving against Vandire. On Kairos, Thor delivered his Sermon of Light at the steps of the Cathedral of Divine Ascension. This address, more theologically sophisticated than his earlier speeches, directly challenged Vandire's interpretations of Imperial doctrine while affirming the fundamental principles of Emperor worship. Thor drew on obscure texts from the early days of the Ecclesiarchy to demonstrate how Vandire's innovations contradicted established doctrine. More significantly, the Sermon of Light outlined Thor's vision for reformation, a return to an ecclesiarchy that supported rather than exploited the imperial population, that cooperated with rather than dominated other imperial institutions, and that focused on humanity's spiritual needs rather than material acquisition. This positive vision, contrasted with the grim reality of Vandire's rule, resonated powerfully with the Shrine World's population. The Kairos Ecclesiarchy, which had maintained a cautious distance from both Vandire and the growing resistance, found itself forced to take a position. Cardinal Alexei Dominicus, after 3 days of prayer and consultation, publicly endorsed Thor's theological positions while carefully avoiding explicit rejection of Vandire's authority. This nuanced stance, supporting Thor's interpretation of doctrine while maintaining nominal loyalty to the institutional ecclesiarchy, would be adopted by many Ministorum officials in the following years. From Kairos, Thor's movement expanded rapidly. The Confederation of Light established its first formal organizational structure, with Thor as its spiritual leader but operational authority distributed among a council of representatives from various sectors and imperial institutions. This decentralized approach proved crucial to the Confederation's survival, as Vandire's forces could not cripple the movement by targeting any single leader or location. Between 261 and 265, Thor traveled constantly, never remaining on any world for more than a few weeks. His appearances followed no discernible pattern, confounding Vandire's intelligence networks. He would preach in the cathedrals of major shrine worlds 1 month, and in the underhives of industrial worlds the next. Each appearance strengthened the Confederation's network and spread his message to new populations. During this period, reports of miracles associated with Thor multiplied. On Kadu 2, witnesses claimed that his blessing healed thousands suffering from radiation sickness following a manufactorum disaster. On Velgard, his sermon reportedly caused the statues of imperial saints to weep tears of gold. On Herodor, his presence coincided with the unexpected return of a lost pilgrim fleet that had been given up for destroyed in the warp. Historical analysis suggests that while some of these events were likely exaggerations or fabrications, others defied conventional explanation. The Inquisition's Ordo Hereticus investigated several of these incidents and found no evidence of psychic manipulation or technological trickery. Some inquisitors privately concluded that Thor might indeed be receiving some form of guidance or blessing from the Emperor's psychic presence. The Confederation of Light's growth accelerated as it absorbed or allied with other resistance movements that had developed independently across the Imperium. The revivalists of the Emperor's Light, who had established communes on frontier worlds, formally joined the Confederation in 262. The Logos Historica Verita, while maintaining its separate identity, began sharing its historical records and analysis with Confederation leaders, providing important context for Thor's theological arguments. Military support for the Confederation emerged gradually. The first significant martial backing came from elements of the Segmentum Pacificus Defense Forces, who had already broken from Vandire's authority under Lord Commander Galvanus. While not formally declaring for Thor, Galvanus ensured that Confederation activities within his sphere of influence remained unmolested by Vandire's forces. More direct military support developed through Thor's connection with Captain Constantinus of the Firehawk Space Marine chapter. The circumstances of their first meeting remain obscure, But by 264, the Fire Hawks had begun providing escort for Thor's movements between systems and protection during his public appearances. This Astartes' involvement lent crucial legitimacy to Thor's movement, as Space Marines were widely recognized as the Emperor's most dedicated servants. The strategic brilliance of Thor's campaign became increasingly apparent as the Confederation expanded. Rather than attempting to control territory or establish alternative governance structures that could be targeted by Vandire's forces, Thor focused on building a distributed network of influence. The Confederation operated through existing Imperial institutions wherever possible, working with planetary governors, administratum officials, and ministorum priests who shared their concerns about Vandire's excesses. This approach created a form of resistance that was extraordinarily difficult to suppress. Vandire could execute individual supporters or even purge entire planetary governments, but the Confederation's influence would simply re-emerge through different channels. The movement's strength lay not in formal hierarchy, but in shared values and decentralized initiative. Thor also demonstrated remarkable skill in uniting disparate resistance groups that might otherwise have remained fragmented. He found common ground between puritanical reformers concerned with doctrinal purity and pragmatic administrators focused on functional governance. He bridged gaps between frontier worlds seeking autonomy and core worlds demanding restored order. He even managed to gain cautious support from elements of the Adeptus Mechanicus by emphasizing the Emperor's role as the Omnissiah and the importance of technological preservation for humanity's survival. By 266, the Confederation of Light had evolved from a religious reform movement into a comprehensive alternative to Vandire's corrupt governance. It maintained communication networks spanning multiple segmentums, coordinated resource distribution to alleviate the worst effects of Vandire's exploitative tithes, and provided protection for individuals and communities targeted by the Fraterus Templar, or the Brides of the Emperor. Throughout this expansion, Thor himself remained a paradoxical figure, highly visible through his sermons and public appearances, but personally elusive. He maintained no permanent residence, traveled with minimal entourage, and delegated most administrative functions to the Confederation's council. This operational security, combined with what many believed to be divine protection, allowed him to evade numerous assassination attempts and capture operations launched by Vandire's agents. The Daughters of the Emperor had remained an enigma to most of the Imperium throughout Vandire's reign. Clad in ornate power armor of crimson and gold, these warrior women had become symbols of the Ecclesiarch's tyrannical authority. Their unwavering loyalty to Vandire stemmed from what they believed was divine validation, his apparent immunity to Law's fire, which they had witnessed on Sanlier decades earlier. This deception, a simple conversion field disguised as a miracle, had transformed a once noble order of shrine guardians into the most feared enforcers of the bloodiest regime since the Horus Heresy. Alicia Dominica led the Daughters during these dark years. Tall and austere, with piercing gray eyes that seemed to look through rather than at those she addressed, Dominica embodied the martial perfection and spiritual devotion that defined her order. Her face, angular and severe, rarely displayed emotion beyond occasional flashes of righteous anger when confronting those she deemed enemies of the faith. She wore her black hair cropped short beneath her helm, a practical choice that became standard among her warriors. The Daughters' headquarters on Terra occupied a fortified compound adjacent to the ecclesiarchal palace. The architecture blended military functionality with religious symbolism, adamantium-reinforced walls adorned with devotional friezes, weapons training grounds centered around massive statues of the Emperor, meditation chambers equipped with both prayer altars and tactical display units. Every aspect of their environment reinforced their dual identity as both warriors and devotees. As Vandire's paranoia reached new heights, the Daughters had become virtually the only military force he fully trusted. The Fraterus Templar, once his primary enforcers, had suffered significant losses against growing resistance and had proven vulnerable to infiltration by Confederation sympathizers. The Imperial Guard regiments on Terra operated under increasingly restrictive protocols that limited their effectiveness. The Adeptus Sororitas maintained order in the broader population, but lacked the fanatical loyalty Vandire demanded for his personal protection. The daughters filled this void, their numbers on Terra growing to nearly 5,000 as Vandire recalled detachments from shrine worlds across the Segmentum Solar. They maintained constant patrols throughout the ecclesiarchal palace and conducted regular purification sweeps of the surrounding administrative districts, arresting or executing anyone suspected of insufficient devotion to Vandire's increasingly erratic doctrinal pronouncements. What made the daughters particularly effective and feared was their combination of superb combat training and absolute conviction. Unlike the Fraterus Templar, many of whom were essentially conscripts given basic weapons training and religious indoctrination, the daughters underwent rigorous martial preparation comparable to that of elite Imperial Guard veterans. Their power armor, while not as sophisticated as Astartes models, provided significant protection and strength enhancement. Their weapons, primarily power swords and bolt pistols, were maintained to exacting standards by dedicated tech priests who had been thoroughly vetted for loyalty to Vandire. More importantly, the daughters operated with the absolute certainty that their actions carried divine sanction. They had witnessed what they believed was the Emperor's direct intervention to protect Vandire. This conviction eliminated hesitation or moral qualms that might have limited other forces. When ordered to execute an entire administrative department for a minor delay in implementing one of Vandire's directives, the daughters carried out the sentence with methodical efficiency, viewing the action as necessary purification rather than mass murder. This combination of capability and conviction made them the perfect instrument for Vandire's increasingly paranoid governance. As resistance to his rule grew across the Imperium, the daughters became more essential to maintaining his position on Terra itself. They intercepted assassination attempts, suppressed internal dissent, and enforced compliance with Vandire's ever-changing religious edicts. Yet beneath this surface of absolute loyalty, subtle changes had begun to manifest among the daughters. Some of the more perceptive warriors had noticed inconsistencies in Vandire's behavior and pronouncements. His claim to receive direct guidance from the Emperor contradicted their own theological understanding that such communication required the mediation of sanctioned psychers or ancient relics. His increasingly erratic demands, such as ordering the execution of servants for imagined slights or demanding architectural modifications to the ecclesiarchal palace that undermined its structural integrity, suggested mental deterioration rather than divine inspiration. These doubts remained unspoken, confined to private thoughts and occasional whispered conversations between the most trusted battle sisters. The daughters' hierarchical structure and emphasis on obedience prevented such concerns from coalescing into organized questioning. However, the seeds of doubt had been planted, creating potential fracture lines in what had appeared to be monolithic loyalty. The catalyst for transforming these private doubts into action came from an unexpected source. In early 378, a force of space marines from several chapters, including the Imperial Fists, Fire Hawks, and Soul Drinkers, established blockades around the Sol system. This Astartes fleet, operating under the authority of the Confederation of Light, declared their intent to remove Vandire from power and end the reign of blood. The Space Marines' intervention represented a profound challenge to the daughters' worldview. The Adeptus Astartes were known throughout the Imperium as the Emperor's most direct servants, genetically engineered for loyalty, and created by the Emperor's own hand during the Great Crusade. Their opposition to Vandire could not be easily dismissed as heresy or treason, particularly when their stated goal was not the overthrow of imperial institutions, but rather the restoration of proper governance. Captain Constantinus of the Fire Hawks, who had emerged as the coalition's primary spokesman, transmitted a message directly to the ecclesiarchal palace. The communication bypassed Vandire's sensors, reaching several daughters' command units simultaneously. In measured tones, Constantinus outlined the evidence of Vandire's mental instability, the theological contradictions in his recent pronouncements, and the devastating impact of his policies on the Imperium's military readiness in the face of Zeno's threats. Most significantly, Constantinus addressed the daughters directly, acknowledging their devotion to the Emperor, while suggesting that this very devotion should compel them to question whether Vandire truly represented the master of mankind's will. He concluded by offering safe passage to any daughter who wished to see evidence of Vandire's corruption firsthand. This message, quickly suppressed by Vandire's communications officers, nevertheless circulated among the daughter's officer corps. Alicia Dominica, upon learning of it, faced the most significant crisis of her leadership. Her initial response, conditioned by decades of loyalty to Vandire, was to order increased security and the identification of any warriors who had accessed the transmission. Yet the message had touched upon doubts she herself had carefully suppressed, forcing her to confront questions she had previously avoided. After several days of intense prayer and meditation, Dominica took an unprecedented step. She convened a private council of her 5 most trusted commanders: Catherine, Silvana, Lucia, Mina, and Helena. These women, who had served alongside Dominica since before Vandire's rise to power, represented the core leadership of the Daughters on Terra. In a chamber deep within the Daughters' fortress, secured against surveillance, Dominica shared her growing concerns about Vandire's mental state and the contradictions between his actions and established Imperial doctrine. The discussion lasted through the night, with each commander contributing observations that, taken individually, might be dismissed, but collectively suggested a pattern of deterioration and corruption. Catherine, the most tactically minded of the group, noted that Vandire's military directives had become increasingly irrational, ordering deployments that weakened rather than strengthened Terra's defenses. Silvana, who oversaw the Daughters' theological training, identified specific instances where Vandire's recent pronouncements directly contradicted canonical texts she had studied since childhood. Lucia, responsible for intelligence gathering, reported increasing evidence that Vandire was executing loyal servants based on imagined conspiracies rather than actual threats. By dawn, the 6 leaders had reached a difficult consensus. They needed to determine the truth about Vandire's legitimacy, independent of his claims and their long-held assumptions. This decision, while logical, represented an extraordinary break from their established practice of unquestioning obedience. Even considering the possibility that Vandire might not be the Emperor's chosen representative constituted a form of heresy by the standards they had enforced for decades. The question of how to proceed led to the most radical proposal of all. Mina, the youngest of the commanders but highly respected for her insight, suggested that they should accept the Space Marines' offer of safe passage, not to defect, but to seek independent verification of Vandire's divine mandate. If his authority truly came from the Emperor, she argued, this would be confirmed by sources beyond Vandire's control, strengthening their resolve to defend him. If not, their duty to the Emperor would require them to reconsider their loyalty to Vandire. After intense debate, Dominica approved this approach. She selected a delegation consisting of herself and the 5 commanders, small enough to travel discreetly, but including sufficient leadership that their findings would carry weight with the remaining Daughters. Using communication channels established during previous anti-assassination operations, they contacted Captain Constantinus and arranged for extraction from Terra. Their departure was executed with the precision expected of the Daughters' elite. During a scheduled patrol of the outer perimeter of the ecclesiarchal district, the 6 warriors diverted to a predetermined rendezvous point where a small Thunderhawk gunship, bearing Firehawk's markings, but operating without transponder identification, awaited them. The extraction occurred without incident, the Daughters' absence concealed by carefully modified patrol logs that would buy them at least 12 hours before their disappearance was discovered. The Thunderhawk transported them not to the Space Marine fleet in orbit, as they had expected, but to an unmarked facility on Luna. Upon landing in a heavily fortified compound built into the lunar regolith, they were met not by Space Marines, but by figures whose appearance caused even the stoic Dominica to falter momentarily, warriors in ancient golden armor, taller than even Astartes, bearing guardian spears of incredibly advanced design. The Adeptus Custodes, the Emperor's personal guardians, had emerged from their self-imposed isolation within the Imperial Palace. Though they had withdrawn from public Imperial governance after the Emperor's internment in the Golden Throne, focusing exclusively on protecting his physical form, the extremity of Vandire's corruption had finally prompted them to intervene. Shield Captain Tyrant, his armor gleaming in the harsh lunar light, greeted the daughters with formal courtesy that barely concealed his assessment of them as potentially hostile. His face, visible beneath his helmet, bore the ageless quality common to custodes, impossible to place as young or old, but marked with the gravitas of centuries of service. Without preamble, he informed them that they would be granted an audience that few living humans had experienced since the Horus Heresy. The daughters were led through corridors of ancient design, the walls inscribed with text in a language none of them recognized. The facility, they gradually realized, predated the Imperium itself, possibly dating back to humanity's first expansion beyond Terra. At the complex's heart lay a teleportation chamber of extraordinarily sophisticated design, maintained by red-robed tech priests who bore symbols identifying them as members of the Divisio Telepathica, specialists in teleportation technology. Shield Captain Tyrant explained the unprecedented nature of what would follow. The daughters would be teleported directly into the inner palace on Terra, bypassing all standard approaches and defense systems. They would be brought before the Eternity Gate itself, the massive portal leading to the Emperor's throne room, to receive direct confirmation of the Emperor's will regarding Vandire's rule. The implications stunned even these hardened warriors. Direct access to the inner palace was restricted to the highest Imperial authorities. Proximity to the Eternity Gate was a privilege granted to only a handful of individuals in each generation. The suggestion that they would receive some form of communication from the Emperor himself seemed almost blasphemous, yet it came from his own guardians, whose authority in this matter could not be questioned. After a brief period for prayer and preparation, the daughters were led onto the teleportation platform. The tech priests began their incantations, the air filling with the scent of sacred oils and the hum of technology far beyond standard Imperial capabilities. Light enveloped the warriors, and reality seemed to fold around them. The teleportation experience itself left an indelible mark on each woman. Later accounts described sensations of temporal distortion, moments stretching into what felt like hours, glimpses of events past and possibly future, a sense of vast presence just beyond normal perception. Whether these effects resulted from the teleportation technology itself or from proximity to the Emperor's psychic presence remains a matter of theological debate. When reality stabilized around them, the daughters found themselves in a vast, dimly lit chamber, unlike anything they had previously experienced. The scale dwarfed even the grandest cathedrals, the ceiling lost in darkness hundreds of meters above. The walls gleamed with gold and precious materials, inscribed with text and imagery depicting humanity's ancient triumphs. The air itself seemed charged with potential, each breath carrying hints of ozone and something indefinable that raised the hair on their necks. Before them stood the Eternity Gate, a structure so massive and ornate that it defied complete comprehension. Crafted from materials that seemed to absorb and emit light simultaneously, the gate bore inscriptions in dozens of languages, some recognizable as ancient Terran scripts, others entirely alien. Custodian guards stood immobile before it, their golden armor seeming to merge with the ambient light guardian spears held at perfect attention. What transpired next has been recorded in numerous versions, each differing in details, but agreeing on the essential outcome. The daughters were brought to their knees, not by physical force, but by the overwhelming psychic pressure emanating from beyond the gate. For an indeterminate period, each experienced what they later described as direct communion with the Emperor's consciousness. The nature of this communion varied between the 6 women. Dominica reported a series of visions showing the consequences of Vandire's continued rule, worlds in flames, the Imperium fractured beyond repair, humanity vulnerable to Xeno's predation on an unprecedented scale. Catherine described a more direct communication, a wordless transfer of understanding that revealed Vandire's corruption and the manipulation he had used to secure the daughters' loyalty. Silvano experienced what she interpreted as access to the Emperor's original intentions for the ecclesiarchy, not as a tool of oppression, but as a means of unifying humanity through shared devotion. When the experience ended, the daughters found themselves once again before the custodes in the lunar facility. Hours had passed, though the experience had seemed both instantaneous and eternal. Each woman bore subtle physical changes. Strands of hair turned permanently white, pupils slightly altered in color, minor rejuvenation of facial tissues, marking them as touched by extraordinary power. More significantly, they shared an absolute certainty regarding their course of action. The Emperor had revealed Vandire's corruption and the deception he had used to secure their loyalty. The miracle they had witnessed on San Lear decades earlier, Vandire's apparent immunity to Law's fire, had been exposed as technological trickery rather than divine intervention. Their duty now was not to Vandire but to the Emperor himself, requiring them to end the reign of blood and restore proper governance to the ecclesiarchy. The return to Terra occurred with the same secrecy as their departure, but with an entirely different purpose. The daughters, now fully aware of their decades of unwitting complicity in Vandire's tyranny, moved with the cold precision of executioners rather than protectors. They timed their return to coincide with one of Vandire's increasingly rare public appearances, a ceremony in the ecclesiarchal palace's grand cathedral, where he planned to execute several cardinals who had questioned his latest doctrinal innovations. The daughters entered the cathedral through side passages known only to Vandire's personal guards. They advanced toward the central dais where Vandire, resplendent in increasingly elaborate vestments that nearly obscured his frail physical form, was delivering a rambling condemnation of his latest enemies. The assembled dignitaries, conditioned to fear any disruption, remained silent as the 6 armored figures approached the ecclesiarch. Vandire's reaction upon seeing Dominica and her commanders reflected his deteriorating mental state. Initial relief at the return of his most loyal servants quickly gave way to paranoid suspicion as he noted their changed demeanor. He demanded immediate explanation for their unauthorized absence, his voice rising to the shrill tone that had become characteristic of his public pronouncements. Dominica's response, recorded by numerous witnesses and later incorporated into ecclesiarchal historical texts, was delivered with the same certainty that had characterized her previous loyalty. "We have received our orders from the Emperor himself." This simple statement, uttered in the presence of hundreds of ecclesiarchal officials, effectively announced the end of Vandire's authority. Vandire's response revealed the depth of his delusion. He declared Dominica and her companions heretics, claiming that only he could communicate with the Emperor. In his increasing agitation, he inadvertently confirmed the deception he had used on San Lear, boasting of how easily he had manipulated the simple-minded women with basic technology. This admission, heard by the assembled ecclesiarchal hierarchy, shattered the last pretense of his divine mandate. As Vandire called for guards to arrest the traitors, Dominica drew her power sword. The weapon, a masterpiece of craftsmanship that had served her through decades of the Reign of Blood, now found its final and most significant target. With a single precise stroke, she separated Vandire's head from his shoulders, ending the Reign of Blood with the same decisiveness that had characterized its worst excesses. The immediate aftermath saw no resistance from the remaining brides of the Emperor stationed throughout the cathedral. Many had harbored their own doubts about Vandire, and the authority with which Dominica acted, combined with the revelation of Vandire's deception, led to immediate acceptance of the changed circumstances. Within hours, word spread throughout Terra that Vandire had fallen and the Reign of Blood had ended. The death of Goge Vandire marked not the end, but merely a new phase of the Age of Apostasy. The Imperium, fractured by decades of misrule, faced the monumental task of reunification. What followed would become known as the Wars of Vindication, a series of campaigns spanning nearly 2 decades that would test the military might and diplomatic skill of Imperial forces loyal to Sebastian Thor's vision of reformation. The immediate aftermath of Vandire's execution created a power vacuum on Terra itself. While the daughters of the Emperor had removed the tyrant, they lacked the political authority to establish new governance structures. This void was temporarily filled by an emergency council comprising representatives from the Adeptus Custodes, the remaining uncorrupted High Lords, and senior officers from Space Marine chapters present in the Sol system. Sebastian Thor arrived on Terra 3 weeks after Vandire's death, transported by a Fire Hawk strike cruiser that cut through the warp with unprecedented speed. His entrance into the Imperial palace was marked by crowds so vast that Adepta Sororitas forces struggled to maintain order. Millions of Terran citizens, many of whom had suffered directly under Vandire's increasingly irrational edicts, lined the processional route, seeking glimpses of the man whose teachings had given them hope during the darkest years. Thor's first official act was to formally dissolve the Frateris Templar, the military arm of the ecclesiarchy that had enforced Vandire's will across countless worlds. This dissolution, while symbolically important, was largely ceremonial. The Templar forces had already fragmented following news of Vandire's death, with many units simply deserting their posts or being absorbed into local planetary defense forces. More significant was Thor's meeting with Alicia Dominica and her commanders. The daughters of the Emperor, instruments of Vandire's tyranny for decades, now found themselves without purpose or direction. Thor, displaying the political acumen that had characterized his rise, did not seek punishment or dissolution of the order. Instead, he proposed transformation. The daughters would become the Adepta Sororitas, an organization dedicated to protecting the reformed ecclesiarchy while ensuring it never again fell prey to the corruption that had enabled Vandire's rise. This reorganization included strict codification of the decree passive, the legal instrument that formally prohibited the ecclesiarchy from maintaining men under arms. The Sororitas, as women, provided a technical exemption to this prohibition, while their new organizational structure, divided between the militant orders militant and the non-combat orders famulus, hospitaller, and dialogus, ensured that military power was balanced by other essential functions. While these reforms progressed on Terra, the practical challenge of reunifying the Imperium loomed large. Vandire's death had not automatically restored Imperial authority across the million worlds of humanity's domain. Many sectors had established autonomous governance during the Reign of Blood, while others had fallen to various forms of corruption or Xeno's incursion as Imperial defenses weakened. The first military actions of the Wars of Vindication targeted not distant rebellious sectors, but Vandire's remaining power base within the Segmentum Solar. Despite his death, numerous worlds remained under the control of officials loyal to his regime, either true believers in his distorted theology or opportunists who had profited from his rule and feared the consequences of reformation. The Shrine world of Ophelia VII exemplified this challenge. Cardinal Bucharest, who had risen to power through unflinching enforcement of Vandire's tithes, refused to acknowledge Thor's authority and declared himself the true heir to Vandire's theological legacy. Bucharest commanded significant military forces, not technically Frateris Templar, but Shrine Guards, who functioned as a well-equipped army in all but name. He fortified the massive cathedral of the Emperor's wisdom, transforming what had been a site of pilgrimage into a virtually impregnable fortress. The task of bringing Ophelia VII back into compliance fell to the Imperial Fists chapter. Captain Darnath Lysander led the assault, employing tactics that balanced the need for decisive victory with the desire to minimize damage to sacred sites. Rather than conducting a conventional siege that would have resulted in massive destruction, Lysander utilized Terminator squads in targeted teleport assaults against key defensive positions, systematically isolating Bucharest from his supporting forces. The campaign culminated in a precision strike against the Cardinal's inner sanctum. Lysander himself, leading a squad of 5 Terminators, teleported directly into Bucharest's private chambers during a meeting of his senior staff. The Imperial Fists eliminated the Cardinal's bodyguards with bolter fire before taking Bucharest himself alive, a deliberate choice that allowed for a public trial that demonstrated the reformed ecclesiarchy's commitment to justice rather than vengeance. This pattern, precise application of overwhelming force followed by visible implementation of reforms, characterized the early Wars of Vindication. The goal was not merely military victory, but the establishment of new governance structures that would prevent the reemergence of Vandire-style corruption. Each successful compliance operation included the installation of ecclesiarchy officials, vetted by Thor's close associates, and the implementation of administrative reforms designed to increase transparency and accountability. As the immediate threats within the Segmentum Solar were neutralized, attention turned to the broader challenge of reintegrating the semi-autonomous regions that had emerged during the Reign of Blood. The Segmentum Pacificus presented the most complex challenge, having established relatively stable governance under the Regency Council, led by Lord Commander Galvanus. Unlike the hardline Vandire loyalists, Galvanus and his associates had maintained nominal loyalty to the Emperor while rejecting Vandire specifically. This nuanced position made military action against them politically problematic. They could not easily be branded as traitors, particularly since their governance had effectively protected their sectors from Xeno's threats that might have otherwise devastated vulnerable human worlds. The solution came through a diplomatic mission led by Thor himself, accompanied by an honor guard comprising both Adeptus Astartes from the Ultramarines chapter and newly commissioned Sororitas from the Order of the Ebon Chalice. The mission traveled to Galvanus's headquarters on Kairos, where Thor proposed not punishment but partnership. The Pacificus would return to full integration with the Imperium, but many of the administrative improvements implemented during its autonomy would be preserved and even expanded to other sectors. This approach recognized the practical reality that some of the reforms necessitated by Vandire's misrule had actually improved governance in regions beyond his direct control. Galvanus, a pragmatic military commander rather than an ideologue, recognized the benefits of reintegration under these terms. The Pacificus Accord, signed in the year 381 of the 36th millennium, became a template for similar negotiations with other autonomous regions, allowing for reintegration without the massive military casualties that forced compliance would have entailed. Not all regions proved amenable to diplomatic solutions. The Gehenna sector, located in the galactic north of Segmentum Obscurus, had fallen under the control of a military junta led by Lord General Tanish Var. Unlike Galvanus, Var had used Vandire's fall as an opportunity for personal power consolidation rather than responsible governance. His regime had imposed harsh martial law across 17 inhabited systems, creating a miniature empire sustained through fear and systematic exploitation of resources. The Black Templars under High Marshal Signandus took the lead in the Gehenna campaign. The chapter's zealous dedication to the Emperor made them particularly suited to a compliance action that carried religious as well as military significance. Signandus deployed 12 Crusade fleets, each targeting specific systems within Var's domain in a coordinated offensive designed to prevent the junta from concentrating its defensive forces. The Black Templars' approach contrasted sharply with the precision strikes favored by the Imperial fists. Where Lysander had employed surgical Terminator teleport assaults, Signandus unleashed the full fury of his chapter in frontal assaults against Var's primary strongholds. Black Templar assault marines descended on government complexes like Angels of Death, their chainswords and bolt pistols reaping a terrible toll among Var's elite guards. Chaplains led charges against fortified positions, their Crozius Arcanum smashing through makeshift barricades, while their skull-faced helms struck terror into conscripted defenders. The campaign reached its climax at the mining world of Kelthar Prime, where Var had established his headquarters in a converted Prometheum refinery. The facility's location within a civilian population center complicated the assault, as the Black Templars sought to minimize collateral damage despite their aggressive tactical doctrine. Signandus solved this dilemma by implementing a three-phase operation, first evacuating civilians from the surrounding habitat blocks, then cutting power and life support to the refinery complex, and finally launching a multi-vector assault once Var's forces were weakened by isolation. The fighting within the refinery complex was brutal but brief. Var's personal guard, equipped with looted power armor and heavy weapons, established defensive positions around the central control hub. The Black Templars advanced through corridors filled with toxic fumes from damaged processing equipment, their power armor protecting them from environmental hazards that had already incapacitated many of the defenders. Signandus himself led the final push into the command center, where Var was found already dead, poisoned by his own senior officers who hoped to negotiate surrender terms. The Gehenna campaign illustrated the military challenges of the Wars of Vindication. Imperial forces had to balance the need for decisive action against the practical reality that excessive destruction undermined the very reconstruction they sought to implement. Each compliance action required not just military victory, but the preservation of essential infrastructure and civilian populations that would form the basis for restored imperial governance. This challenge became even more acute when dealing with worlds that had fallen to more insidious forms of corruption during Vandire's reign. On Savhaven, a formerly compliant hive world in Segmentum Tempestus, the planetary governor had maintained a facade of loyalty while secretly allowing a Slaaneshi cult to infiltrate the upper echelons of society. By the time Imperial forces arrived to re-establish authority, nearly the entire ruling class had been corrupted, with demonic entities inhabiting the bodies of key officials. The Grey Knights, deployed in secret by Inquisitor Lord Hezekiah Carmelus, spearheaded the purification of Savhaven. 5 full squads of the secretive chapter teleported directly into the governor's palace during what appeared to be a routine administrative gathering. The resulting conflict, while hidden from public view, resulted in the elimination of over 300 corrupted officials and the banishment of 7 minor demons that had manifested in physical form. The subsequent governance challenge proved even more difficult than the military action. With the planet's entire administrative class either dead or compromised, Imperial authorities were forced to implement direct military governance while training new civilian administrators recruited from lower hive levels. This process took nearly 5 years, during which production capacity remained significantly below pre-compliance levels, creating resource shortages that affected military operations in neighboring sectors. Similar situations arose across dozens of worlds, particularly those that had been isolated from regular ecclesiarchal oversight during the later years of Vandire's reign. The correlation between isolation and corruption necessitated the development of new oversight mechanisms that would prevent future occurrences while respecting the necessary autonomy of distant worlds. The solution emerged in the form of expanded Adeptus Arbites presence and regular circuit visits by members of the Order's Famulus of the Adepta Sororitas. These non-militant sororitas, trained in diplomacy and administration, could identify signs of corruption without the intimidating presence of military forces, allowing for early intervention before situations deteriorated to the point of requiring compliance actions. Beyond the challenges of corruption and resistance, the Wars of Vindication faced the practical difficulty of fighting on multiple fronts while simultaneously rebuilding Imperial infrastructure. Military assets remained stretched thin, with many formations having suffered significant losses during the fragmentation of Imperial authority. Naval vessels that had been damaged in earlier conflicts often operated with minimal repairs, their machine spirits soothed by overworked tech priests attempting to maintain combat readiness without proper dockyard facilities. This scarcity of military resources necessitated careful prioritization of compliance actions. Worlds with strategic value, those controlling key warp routes, possessing significant manufacturing capacity, or located at critical defensive positions, received priority attention, while less significant planets sometimes waited years for formal reintegration into Imperial governance structures. The Adeptus Mechanicus, still dealing with its own internal schism, provided inconsistent support to these efforts. Forge worlds aligned with Mars generally contributed to compliance actions within their immediate spheres of influence, while those following the Moiri doctrine focused on re-establishing technological standards rather than direct military support. This divided approach further complicated logistical challenges, as equipment and ammunition manufactured on different Forge worlds often required field modifications to maintain compatibility. Space Marine chapters shouldered a disproportionate burden during this period, their self-sufficiency and combat effectiveness making them ideal for operations in regions with limited support infrastructure. The Ultramarines, leveraging the resources of their mini-empire in Ultramar, conducted compliance actions across 17 sectors in Segmentum Ultima. The White Scars deployed fast-moving strike forces to secure outlying systems, where Imperial authority had been nominal even before Vandire's rise. The Raven Guard specialized in decapitation operations against particularly recalcitrant planetary governments, their infiltration capabilities allowing for targeted removal of corrupt leadership with minimal collateral damage. Sebastian Thor's ascension to the position of Ecclesiarch in 380 marked the beginning of the most comprehensive restructuring of imperial governance since the aftermath of the Horus Heresy. The man who had begun as a humble preacher on an unremarkable agri-world now stood at the pinnacle of the Adeptus Ministorum, tasked with rebuilding an institution corrupted by decades of Vandire's influence. Thor's first formal appearance before the Senatorum Imperialis demonstrated his approach to leadership. Unlike Vandire, who had favored ornate vestments and theatrical displays of authority, Thor dressed in simple robes of undyed cloth, adorned only with a small aquila pendant. His physical presence contrasted sharply with the opulence of the Senate chambers, a deliberate statement that substance would take precedence over spectacle in his administration. The newly appointed Ecclesiarch addressed the assembled High Lords with characteristic directness. He acknowledged the damage done to imperial institutions during the Reign of Blood and outlined a comprehensive program of reforms designed to prevent similar abuses in the future. These reforms would extend beyond the ecclesiarchy itself to re-establish the checks and balances that had originally been intended to prevent any single imperial organization from gaining excessive power. Thor's first major reform initiative focused on the Adeptus Ministorum's internal structure. He dissolved the Office of Special Assessment, which Vandire had used to eliminate rivals through false accusations of heresy. In its place, Thor established the Convent Prioress and Convent Sanctorum, administrative bodies headquartered on Terra and Ophelia 7 respectively, creating a deliberate division of ecclesiarchal authority that would prevent future centralization of power. The Adepta Sororitas, formalized from the reformed daughters of the Emperor, became a cornerstone of Thor's restructured Ministorum. Under Alicia Dominica's leadership, the Sororitas developed a complex organizational structure that balanced military capability with theological oversight. The Order's militant provided the ecclesiarchy with dedicated protectors, while the non-militant orders Famulus, Hospitaller, and Dialogus ensured that the Ministorum's broader social responsibilities would not be neglected. The most significant legal reform came with the formal codification of the Decree Passive in 381. This landmark legislation, enacted with the full support of the High Lords of Terra, explicitly prohibited the ecclesiarchy from maintaining men under arms. The careful wording, focusing specifically on male troops, allowed for the continued existence of the all-female Sororitas military orders, while preventing the reformation of anything resembling the fraterist Templar forces that had enforced Vandire's will across the Imperium. The implementation of the Decree Passive required the dissolution of numerous ecclesiarchal military formations beyond the already disbanded fraterist Templar. The Crusaders, male warriors who had traditionally served as bodyguards for senior ecclesiarchy officials, were reorganized into independent orders that contracted their services to the Ministorum rather than falling under its direct command. Fraterist militia units, local defense forces raised by Shrine Worlds, were either disbanded or absorbed into planetary defense forces under the authority of planetary governors rather than cardinals. This restructuring faced resistance from cardinals who had grown accustomed to commanding their own military forces. Thor addressed this opposition not through purges or forced compliance, but through a series of theological disputations held in the Cathedral of the Emperor's Wisdom on Ophelia 7. Over the course of 17 days, Thor systematically demonstrated how the militarization of the ecclesiarchy had contributed to Vandire's abuses and contradicted the Emperor's original intent for the Ministorum as a spiritual rather than martial institution. The theological arguments proved persuasive where threats might have failed. One by one, senior ecclesiarchy officials publicly surrendered their military commands, often in elaborate ceremonies, where weapons and unit standards were symbolically transferred to planetary defense force commanders or representatives of the Adepta Sororitas. These ceremonies, broadcast across thousands of worlds via astropathic choir, reinforced the message that the reforms represented a return to proper imperial tradition rather than a revolutionary break. Beyond the ecclesiarchy itself, Thor worked to rebalance power among the High Lords of Terra. The position of ecclesiarch, which had dominated the Senatorum Imperialis under Vandire, was deliberately scaled back in its authority. Thor insisted that his voice carry equal weight to that of other High Lords rather than the overriding authority Vandire had claimed. This self-limitation of power, coming from the most popular and potentially influential figure in the post-apostasy Imperium, established a powerful precedent for future governance. The administrative relationship between the ecclesiarchy and other imperial institutions underwent careful recalibration. The Adeptus Administratum, which had been effectively subordinated to Vandire's personal authority, regained its independent role in managing imperial resources. The master of the Administratum, Lord Phaedrus, worked closely with Thor to disentangle the bureaucratic structures that Vandire had merged for his personal benefit, re-establishing clear jurisdictional boundaries between the organizations. This separation extended to financial matters as well. Under Vandire, ecclesiarchal and administratum treasuries had been combined, allowing him to redirect imperial resources to his personal projects without oversight. Thor implemented strict accounting protocols that required multiple independent verifications for any significant transfer of funds between imperial organizations. These protocols, while increasing administrative complexity, created transparency that made future abuses more difficult to conceal. The Adeptus Mechanicus, still recovering from its own schism, found in Thor a surprisingly technologically literate partner. Unlike many ecclesiarchs who had viewed the Mechanicus with suspicion or incomprehension, Thor demonstrated a practical understanding of how technological preservation served the Emperor's will. He publicly supported Fabricator General Gastaf Hediatrix's efforts to reintegrate Moiri-aligned Forge worlds, framing technological unity as a theological imperative rather than merely a practical necessity. This support manifested in the Roxburgh Compact of 383, where representatives of the Ecclesiarchy and Mechanicus formally reaffirmed the ancient agreements that had bound their organizations since the Great Crusade. The compact explicitly acknowledged the Emperor's dual nature as both the object of human worship and the omnissiah venerated by the Mechanicus, creating theological common ground that helped heal divisions within both institutions. The imperial military establishment, which had fragmented during the Reign of Blood, required particularly careful handling. Thor worked closely with Lord Commander Militant Takar to re-establish clear chains of command, while ensuring that no single military leader could accumulate the kind of unquestioned authority that might threaten civilian governance. Regional command structures were reorganized to require consensus between multiple officers for major deployments, creating deliberate redundancies that prevented rapid power consolidation. Naval assets, which had been particularly vulnerable to appropriation during Vandire's reign, received special attention. Thor supported the creation of the Novgorod Protocols, which formalized the relationship between battle fleet commanders and sector governors. These protocols established clear circumstances under which Imperial Navy assets could be deployed for internal security purposes, creating safeguards against the kind of military intimidation Vandire had employed against potentially resistant worlds. The Inquisition, which had maintained its independence more successfully than most imperial institutions during the apostasy, found in Thor a respectful but cautious ally. He acknowledged the Inquisition's essential role in protecting the Imperium from internal threats, while gently encouraging reforms that would prevent the kind of infiltration Vandire had achieved in certain Ordo Hereticus elements. The most significant of these reforms was the establishment of regular conclaves, where representatives from all three major ordos would review each other's activities, creating internal accountability without compromising the Inquisition's broader autonomy. Thor's most profound and lasting impact came through his reformation of imperial religious doctrine. The theological distortions introduced during Vandire's reign had created confusion and conflict across thousands of worlds, with competing interpretations of the Emperor's will leading to violence between communities that should have stood united. Thor recognized that simply reversing Vandire's innovations would create further instability. Instead, he initiated a careful process of doctrinal clarification and reconciliation. The Synod of Gathalammer, convened in 386, brought together theological experts from across the Imperium to establish definitive interpretations of core Imperial doctrine. The resulting document, the Gathalammer Catechism, provided clear guidance on essential matters of faith while allowing for regional variation in specific practices. This balance between doctrinal unity and practical flexibility proved crucial for reintegrating worlds that had developed divergent religious traditions during their isolation. Central to Thor's theological reforms was a renewed emphasis on the Emperor's divinity, coupled with practical compassion for humanity. Where Vandire had used the Emperor's divine status as justification for cruelty and exploitation, Thor presented it as the foundation for a unified human purpose. His sermons, delivered in person on hundreds of worlds and distributed by missionary vessels to thousands more, consistently emphasized that devotion to the Emperor manifested through service to humanity as a whole. This theological position had practical governance implications. Thor established the principle that imperial institutions existed to preserve humanity rather than to exercise power for its own sake. This seemingly obvious concept represented a significant shift from the increasingly self-serving institutional culture that had developed under Vandire, where bureaucratic procedures and hierarchical authority had become ends in themselves rather than means to ensure human survival. The implementation of these doctrinal reforms required an extensive educational effort. Thor established new seminary standards for ecclesiarchy priests, emphasizing historical knowledge and practical administrative skills alongside theological training. The Order's Dialogus of the Adepta Sororitas took primary responsibility for this educational mission, creating standardized instructional materials that could be distributed even to isolated worlds with limited communication access. On frontier worlds, where formal ecclesiarchy presence had always been limited, Thor instituted the itinerant preacher program. This initiative dispatched pairs of trained missionaries to travel continuous circuits through remote systems, providing consistent doctrinal guidance while gathering information about local conditions that might require administrative attention. These preachers, equipped with standardized texts but trained to adapt their presentation to local cultures, became crucial links between distant human communities and the broader Imperium. The practical effects of Thor's reforms became apparent within years rather than decades. Administrative efficiency improved as clarified jurisdictional boundaries reduced interdepartmental conflicts. Military readiness increased as resources previously diverted to Vandire's personal projects returned to their intended purposes. Most significantly, the crushing burden of excessive tithes was alleviated, allowing struggling worlds to rebuild their productive capacity rather than being driven further into poverty. Shrine worlds, which had suffered particular corruption under Vandire's direction, underwent comprehensive reorganization. The massive cathedral construction projects that had consumed resources without providing practical benefits were either repurposed for community use or scaled back to sustainable levels. The vast wealth accumulated in ecclesiarchal treasuries was partially redistributed to support practical infrastructure development, with particular emphasis on education and healthcare facilities operated by the Order's Hospitaller. The reformed ecclesiarchy's approach to imperial governance emphasized substantive support rather than mere symbolic presence. Where Vandire's representatives had focused on extracting resources and enforcing doctrinal compliance, Thor's administrators worked with planetary governors to address practical challenges. This cooperative approach rebuilt trust in imperial institutions that had been severely damaged during the Reign of Blood. Thor's personal leadership style reinforced these institutional changes. Unlike Vandire, who had isolated himself within layers of security and intermediaries, Thor maintained direct contact with ordinary imperial citizens. His practice of hearing public petitions during his frequent travels created opportunities for systemic problems to reach his attention before they developed into crises. This accessibility, while creating security challenges that concerned his advisors, generated invaluable intelligence about conditions across the Imperium. The Thorian Reformation, as historians would later name this period, represented not a revolutionary break from imperial tradition, but rather a return to the balanced governance that had been intended since the establishment of the High Lords after the Horus Heresy. By restoring checks and balances between imperial institutions, Thor created resilience against future corruption while maintaining the unified authority necessary to govern humanity's vast domain. The formation of distinct philosophical factions within the Inquisition was not a new phenomenon in imperial history. Since its founding in the early days of the Imperium, the Holy Ordos had always contained diverse interpretations of how best to safeguard humanity. However, the Age of Apostasy created unprecedented conditions that crystallized several competing ideologies into formal factions that would influence inquisitorial doctrine for millennia to come. The Thorians emerged first, taking their name from Sebastian Thor himself. Inquisitor Lord Goldo was the faction's earliest proponent, having witnessed Thor's apparent miracles during the latter stages of the rebellion against Vandire. Goldo had been present on Kairos when Thor's sermon reportedly caused the statues of imperial saints to weep tears of gold, an event he personally investigated and found no technological or psychic explanation for. After extensive examination of evidence from multiple worlds where Thor had appeared, Goldo formulated what would become the core Thorian belief that the Emperor could manifest his will through chosen vessels among humanity. This theological position represented a significant evolution in inquisitorial thought. Previous doctrine had largely focused on identifying and eliminating threats rather than recognizing potential divine intervention in human affairs. Goldo's treatise, The Incarnation Imperative, circulated among trusted colleagues in the year 385 of the 36th millennium, arguing that Thor's emergence during the Imperium's darkest hour since the Horus Heresy demonstrated the Emperor's continuing active interest in humanity's survival. The Thorian position gained substantial support among inquisitors who had witnessed the Age of Apostasy firsthand. Those who had seen the Imperium brought to the brink of collapse found comfort in the belief that the Emperor remained an active force in human history rather than merely a distant figurehead. The faction attracted particular support from inquisitors with backgrounds in the ecclesiarchy or those who had worked closely with the Adepta Sororitas during the Wars of Vindication. Inquisitor Moriana, formerly a mid-ranking official in the Adeptus Administratum before joining the Inquisition, became one of the most methodical proponents of Thorian thought. She established a systematic approach to identifying potential vessels of the Emperor's will, creating a classification system for various types of apparent divine intervention. Her work distinguished between passive manifestation and active incarnation. The Thorian faction established its first formal conclave on Kairos in 387, bringing together 37 inquisitors from various ordos who shared their interpretation of the Emperor's nature. This gathering established protocols for investigating potential manifestations and created secure communication networks for sharing relevant information without alerting potential enemies to their activities. The conclave also formalized the relationship between Thorian inquisitors and the reformed ecclesiarchy, creating carefully limited cooperation while maintaining necessary inquisitorial independence. In opposition to the Thorians, the Horusian faction coalesced around a fundamentally different interpretation of the apostasy's lessons. Where the Thorians saw Thor's rise as evidence of the Emperor's continuing benevolent intervention, the Horusians focused on the power vacuum that had enabled Vandire's corruption in the first place. Their name derived from their study of the Horus Heresy, specifically, how the tremendous psychic and physical power of the Primarchs had shaped human history. Inquisitor Mauritia, a veteran of the Ordo Malleus with extensive experience combating demonic incursions, formulated the initial Horusian position. Having witnessed firsthand the reality that the Emperor's psychic presence was insufficient to protect humanity from all threats, Mauritia proposed a radical alternative to waiting for divine intervention. In her classified manuscript, The Primarch Paradigm, she suggested that humanity might need to actively create vessels for the Emperor's power rather than passively hoping for natural manifestations. This position drew from historical records of the Emperor's creation of the Primarchs and the genetic engineering that produced the Space Marines. Mauritia argued that if the Emperor had once created superhuman beings to lead humanity, similar methods might be necessary in the current age, when his direct intervention was limited by his internment in the Golden Throne. This approach appealed particularly to inquisitors with backgrounds in the Adeptus Mechanicus, or those who had worked extensively with genetic modification technologies. The Horusian faction established its first formal structure under Inquisitor Lord Phaedon, who had maintained a secret research facility on the moon of Farnus in the Helican subsector. This facility, disguised as a standard inquisitorial monitoring station, contained extensive laboratories for genetic and psychic research. Phaedon gathered a cadre of like-minded inquisitors who believed that understanding and potentially replicating the processes that had created the Primarchs might be humanity's best hope for long-term survival. The philosophical division between Thorians and Horusians reflected broader tensions within Imperial governance following the apostasy. The Thorians aligned with Thor's emphasis on returning to traditional Imperial values and structures, believing that the Emperor's established plans remained sufficient if properly implemented. The Horusians, in contrast, argued that changing circumstances required new approaches, even if these approached the boundaries of what traditional Imperial doctrine considered acceptable. This ideological split became particularly evident in how the two factions investigated Vandire's reign. Thorian inquisitors focused primarily on identifying and eliminating lingering corruption within Imperial institutions, viewing Vandire's rise as a failure of institutional safeguards rather than evidence of external manipulation. Horusian investigators, meanwhile, devoted significant resources to examining whether warp entities had directly influenced Vandire's mental deterioration, seeking patterns that might help identify similar vulnerabilities in other Imperial leaders. Inquisitor Glavian Ortiz, a prominent Thorian operating within the Ordo Hereticus, led the most comprehensive investigation into ecclesiarchal corruption during the early Reformation period. With a small but highly trained retinue including 3 Adepta Sororitas from the Order of the Sacred Rose, Ortiz methodically examined records from over 200 shrine worlds that had been directly administered by cardinals known to be Vandire loyalists. This painstaking work revealed a pattern of doctrinal distortion that had begun decades before Vandire's rise to power, subtle changes in theological texts that had gradually prepared the ground for his more radical innovations. Ortiz's findings resulted in the purification protocols, adopted by both the Inquisition and the Reformed Ecclesiarchy in 388. These protocols established standardized procedures for examining religious texts for unauthorized modifications, creating multiple independent verification systems to prevent future doctrinal drift. The protocols also mandated regular rotation of administrative personnel between different shrine worlds, reducing the risk of localized corruption becoming entrenched and spreading. The practical implementation of these protocols fell largely to the Order's Dialogus of the Adepta Sororitas, whose linguistic expertise made them ideal for identifying subtle textual alterations. Working in cooperation with Thorian inquisitors, the Sisters Dialogus conducted comprehensive reviews of ecclesiarchal libraries across the Segmentum Solar, identifying and correcting thousands of doctrinally suspect texts. This massive undertaking, which continued for nearly 2 decades, represented one of the most successful collaborations between the Inquisition and another imperial institution in the post-apostasy period. While the Thorians focused on institutional corruption, Horusian inquisitors pursued evidence of direct warp influence during Vandire's reign. Inquisitor Nahum Shrek, operating with the reluctant approval of the Ordo Malleus leadership, conducted psychic forensic examinations of locations where Vandire had spent significant time, including his private chambers in the ecclesiarchal palace. Using specially trained sanctioned psychers and experimental detection equipment provided by Mechanicus allies, Shrek sought residual warp signatures that might indicate demonic presence or influence. The results of these investigations proved inconsistent and controversial. In some locations, particularly Vandire's meditation chamber and personal library, Shrek's team detected anomalous psychic residues consistent with prolonged warp entity contact. However, other inquisitorial experts disputed these findings, arguing that the residues could have resulted from Vandire's own deteriorating mental state rather than external influence. The ambiguity of this evidence created further division between the factions, with Horusians citing it as justification for more aggressive preventative measures, while Thorians remained skeptical. Beyond these philosophical divisions, practical inquisitorial response to the apostasy focused on identifying and eliminating individuals who had actively participated in Vandire's worst excesses. The newly invigorated Ordo Hereticus, which had been partially compromised during Vandire's reign, undertook systematic purges of officials who had implemented his most destructive policies. These purges, conducted with careful attention to evidence and due process rather than the arbitrary executions that had characterized Vandire's own purges, nevertheless resulted in thousands of executions across the Segmentum Solar alone. Inquisitor Katarina Greyfax, whose methodical approach to investigation became a template for post-apostasy hereticus procedures, established the principle of graduated culpability that guided these purges. This doctrine distinguished between officials who had enthusiastically implemented Vandire's most egregious directives, those who had complied out of fear or institutional loyalty, and those who had engaged in passive resistance through deliberate inefficiency or selective enforcement. This nuanced approach allowed the Inquisition to remove the most dangerous elements while preserving the administrative expertise necessary for effective governance. The practical challenges of these purges were considerable. Many of Vandire's most loyal supporters had destroyed incriminating records during the final days of his reign, making evidence-based prosecution difficult. Others had fled to distant sectors, assuming new identities or seeking protection from local authorities who remained sympathetic to Vandire's theological positions. The Inquisition responded by deploying specialized investigation teams, combining conventional interrogation techniques with limited psychic probing, creating a more reliable process for identifying genuine Vandire loyalists. These investigations extended beyond Terra to hundreds of worlds where Vandire's influence had been strongest. On Ophelia 7, where Cardinal Bucharest had maintained a miniature version of Vandire's reign even after the Ecclesiarch's death, inquisitorial teams spent nearly 5 years unraveling networks of corruption that had permeated every level of planetary governance. Similar operations on shrine worlds like San Lear, Gathalamer, and Kairos revealed complex patterns of complicity and resistance that defied simple categorization. The most challenging aspects of these purges involved worlds where Vandire's representatives had integrated themselves into local power structures to such a degree that removing them threatened planetary stability. On Caris Cephalon, an industrial world in Segmentum Tempestus, the ecclesiarchal administration had merged with the planetary noble houses through strategic marriages and economic partnerships. Inquisitor Dalen Kairosius faced the dilemma of either allowing known Vandire loyalists to retain positions of influence or potentially triggering civil war by removing them. His solution, a carefully managed transition that removed the most egregious offenders while allowing others to maintain positions under strict monitoring, became a model for similar situations across the Imperium. As the immediate threat of Vandire loyalists diminished, inquisitorial attention shifted to preventing similar corruption in the future. This preventative focus led to the establishment of new monitoring protocols that would become standard Ordo Hereticus procedure for centuries to come. The most significant of these was the Ecclesiastical Assessment Program, which placed discrete inquisitorial observers within major ecclesiarchal installations throughout the Imperium. These observers, often operating under cover as administrative staff or minor clergy, provided regular reports on any signs of doctrinal deviation or power concentration that might indicate emerging corruption. Complementing these covert measures, the Inquisition established more formal oversight mechanisms in cooperation with the Reformed ecclesiarchy. Joint review boards combining inquisitorial representatives with senior ecclesiarchal officials conducted regular assessments of major shrine worlds, examining both doctrinal conformity and administrative practices. These reviews, while occasionally creating tension between the organizations, provided an essential safeguard against the kind of institutional drift that had enabled Vandire's rise. The Ordo Hereticus also developed new training protocols for its members, incorporating lessons from the apostasy into standard inquisitorial education. Interrogator preparation now included extensive study of Vandire's methods, with particular attention to how he had manipulated existing imperial institutions rather than creating entirely new structures. This historical analysis was paired with practical training in identifying early warning signs of institutional corruption, creating a more proactive approach to potential internal threats. Technology played an increasingly important role in these preventative measures. The Inquisition worked with Mechanicus allies to develop enhanced data analysis systems capable of identifying suspicious patterns in administrative records, unusual resource allocations, statistical anomalies in promotion patterns, or unexpected changes in communication frequencies between officials. These systems, while primitive by Dark Age standards, represented significant advances in the Imperium's capacity to monitor its own functioning. The most controversial aspect of post-apostasy inquisitorial activity involved psychic monitoring of high-ranking Imperial officials. Drawing on techniques developed during the investigation of Vandire's possible warp corruption, certain inquisitors, primarily those aligned with Horusian philosophy, implemented discrete psychic screening programs for individuals in sensitive positions. These screenings, conducted without the subject's knowledge, using specially trained sanctioned psychers, sought to identify signs of external influence or psychological deterioration, similar to what Vandire had experienced. This practice generated significant debate within the Inquisition itself. Thorian inquisitors generally opposed such measures, arguing that they constituted unwarranted intrusion into the minds of loyal servants and risked creating the very paranoia and instability they sought to prevent. Horusians countered that the catastrophic consequences of Vandire's reign justified extraordinary preventative measures, particularly for officials with authority over multiple worlds or significant military assets. The compromise position that eventually emerged limited such screenings to specific circumstances and required approval from multiple inquisitor lords rather than allowing individual inquisitors to implement them at will. This restricted approach balanced security concerns with practical limitations and ethical considerations, creating a system that provided some protection against potential corruption without undermining the trust necessary for effective governance. Beyond these specific measures, the most significant inquisitorial response to the apostasy was a broad philosophical shift toward greater internal accountability. The realization that elements of the Inquisition itself had been compromised during Vandire's rise led to uncomfortable but necessary self-examination. Inquisitor Lord Parnival Grundig, a respected veteran of the Ordo Xenos who had maintained his independence throughout the apostasy, established the Conclave of Reflection in 390 specifically to address these concerns. The Conclave, which brought together representatives from all major inquisitorial factions, including both Thorians and Horusians, produced the Grundig Protocols that would guide inquisitorial operations for centuries to come. These protocols established regular internal reviews of inquisitorial activities, created secure channels for raising concerns about potentially compromised colleagues, and formalized the principle that no inquisitor, regardless of rank or reputation, was beyond scrutiny when evidence suggested potential corruption. The economic devastation wrought by the Age of Apostasy extended far beyond the immediate destruction of war. As the 37th millennium dawned, Imperial economists and administratum assessors began the monumental task of quantifying the damage to humanity's domain. What they discovered painted a grim picture of systemic collapse that would take centuries to fully address. The Agritha sector in Segmentum Pacificus offered a representative case study of this devastation. Once a prosperous region known for its abundant promethium reserves and thriving manufactoria, the sector had been subjected to 7 successive tithe increases during the later years of Vandire's reign. By the time Thorian reforms reached the sector, industrial output had fallen to less than 30% of pre-apostasy levels. The specialized forge world of Agritha Secundus, which had produced precision targeting systems for Imperial Navy vessels, stood completely abandoned, its population having fled or starved when resource shipments ceased. Administratum recovery teams discovered entire production lines left mid-operation, tools dropped where workers had abandoned them during the final evacuation. The specialized knowledge required to manufacture certain components had been lost entirely with the death of master artisans who had carried manufacturing secrets in their minds rather than in easily accessible records. Similar scenarios played out across thousands of specialized production centers throughout the Imperium. The disruption of interstellar trade created cascading failures in interdependent economic systems. The hive world of Necromunda, which had maintained relatively stable governance throughout the apostasy, nevertheless saw 3 entire hive spires abandoned due to critical component shortages. The environmental systems that made these massive structures habitable required replacement parts manufactured only on specific forge worlds that had ceased production during the conflict. Without these components, atmospheric processors failed, forcing the relocation of millions of citizens into already overcrowded habitable zones. Food production suffered catastrophic decline across multiple sectors. Agricultural worlds that had been forced to exceed sustainable harvest levels to meet Vandire's tithe demands found their soil-depleted and irrigation systems collapsed. The agri-world of Pelen in Segmentum Obscurus, once capable of feeding 12 neighboring systems, became a net importer of food as its once fertile plains turned to dust. Specialized harvesting equipment lay rusting in abandoned fields, with no replacement parts available and insufficient technical knowledge remaining to effect repairs. The human cost of this economic collapse manifested in demographic shifts of staggering proportions. The population of the Helican subsector declined by an estimated 38 billion souls during the apostasy, a figure that included not only direct casualties from conflict, but also deaths from starvation, disease, and exposure following infrastructure collapse. Entire generations had been lost on some worlds, creating age distribution anomalies that would affect labor availability and social stability for centuries. More insidious than these raw population losses were the changes in population distribution. Vandire's policies of forced relocation had moved millions of skilled workers from their original worlds to support his massive construction projects. When these projects collapsed following his death, these displaced populations rarely returned to their homeworlds. Instead, they formed refugee communities on whatever worlds they could reach, creating concentrated pockets of specific technical skills in unexpected locations while leaving critical gaps elsewhere. The forge world of Lucius found itself with a surplus of agricultural specialists, but critically short of mid-level tech priests. Conversely, the agri-world of Drepana hosted thousands of displaced manufactoria workers with no industrial facilities to employ their skills. This misalignment of human resources and economic needs complicated recovery efforts, as simply rebuilding physical infrastructure proved insufficient without properly trained personnel to operate it. Currency systems, already strained by the normal challenges of interstellar economics, collapsed entirely in some regions. The Vandire script that had been forcibly implemented across the Segmentum Solar became worthless overnight following his execution. Local exchange systems emerged to fill the void, ranging from simple barter arrangements to complex commodity-backed currencies specific to individual sectors. This financial fragmentation further complicated recovery efforts, as resources could not easily be directed to where they were most needed without stable exchange mechanisms. The Administratum, under the leadership of Lord Phaedrus, implemented emergency economic measures to address these challenges. The stabilization protocols, established in the 387th year of the 36th millennium, created standardized resource allocation frameworks that bypassed traditional market mechanisms in critical sectors. These protocols prioritized essential production, food, basic medici supplies, and military equipment, while temporarily suspending luxury goods manufacturing. While effective as an emergency measure, the protocols inadvertently reinforced centralized economic control in a manner that some critics compared to Vandire's own command economy approach. More successful were the knowledge preservation initiatives, implemented jointly by the Administratum and the Adeptus Mechanicus. These programs identified individuals with rare technical skills and deployed them strategically to train new generations of specialists. Mobile education units traveled between worlds, providing accelerated instruction in critical technologies. While this approach could not fully replace the depth of knowledge lost during the apostasy, it helped preserve essential capabilities that might otherwise have disappeared entirely. The economic fragmentation of the Imperium created opportunities for certain worlds to establish new patterns of influence. The Sebastian worlds, planets that had been early supporters of Thor's Reformation movement, leveraged their political connection to the new ecclesiarch to secure preferential resource allocations and trade agreements. These worlds, primarily located in Segmentum Obscurus near Thor's homeworld of Dimammer, formed a loose economic confederation that would eventually develop distinct cultural and administrative characteristics. Dimammer itself, once an unremarkable agri-world, became a major pilgrimage destination and administrative center. The modest farming community of Heidelberg, Thor's birthplace, transformed into a shrine city that attracted millions of visitors annually. This influx created economic opportunities, but also strained local resources, necessitating significant infrastructure development. By the early 38th millennium, Dimammer had developed specialized industries focused on producing religious artifacts and accommodating pilgrim needs, fundamentally altering its economic character. Other Sebastian worlds underwent similar transformations. The mining world of Kairos, where Thor had delivered his Sermon of Light, redirected its industrial capacity toward producing ornate metalwork for religious purposes. The Hive world of Veneris, which had provided early military support to Thor's movement, established specialized training facilities for Frateris militia units permitted under the Reformed Decree Passive. These worlds maintained distinctive theological traditions that emphasized Thor's teachings about practical compassion and administrative transparency. The cultural impact of the apostasy extended far beyond economic disruption, leaving profound marks on imperial art, literature, and historical understanding. The period immediately following Vandire's fall saw an explosion of artistic expression addressing the traumatic events of his reign. Much of this work was explicitly propagandistic, commissioned by the Reformed ecclesiarchy to reinforce the legitimacy of Thor's leadership and the righteousness of Vandire's overthrow. The most famous example of this commemorative art was the massive fresco cycle, The Tyrant's Fall, which adorned the interior dome of the Cathedral of the Emperor's Wisdom on Ophelia 7. Painted by the master artist Gervais Murraybau over a period of 17 years, the cycle depicted key moments from the Age of Apostasy in vivid, emotionally charged scenes. The central panel, showing Alicia Dominica executing Vandire while bathed in golden light suggested to represent the Emperor's approval, became one of the most reproduced images in Imperial religious art. More nuanced artistic responses emerged as decades passed. The sculptor Antonin Dvorak created The Witnesses, a series of stark metallic figures representing ordinary citizens affected by Vandire's policies. These haunting forms, installed in public squares across multiple worlds, depicted emaciated refugees, grieving parents, and exhausted laborers. Unlike the triumphalist imagery of official ecclesiarchal art, Dvorak's work focused on the human suffering that had defined the period, creating spaces for public mourning and reflection. Literary responses to the apostasy evolved similarly from initial propaganda to more complex exploration. Early works like Confessor Dahlans, The Light Returns, presented simplified narratives of heroic resistance and divine intervention. Later texts such as Magos Historicus Elena Koval's Voices from the Darkness collected first-person accounts from survivors across multiple worlds, presenting a more nuanced picture of how ordinary citizens had experienced Vandire's reign and its aftermath. Historical records from the Apostasy period presented unique challenges for Imperial scholars. Vandire had systematically destroyed or altered official documents to support his narratives, while resistance groups had often operated with minimal written communication for security reasons. The result was a fragmentary historical record with significant gaps and contradictions. The Logos Historica Verita, which had maintained secret archives throughout the period, played a crucial role in reconstructing accurate timelines and preserving unaltered primary sources. This historical ambiguity created space for competing narratives about the apostasy's causes and significance. The official ecclesiarchal position, formalized in the Thorian histories, commissioned by Sebastian Thor himself, emphasized institutional failure and the corruption of individual leaders rather than systemic flaws in imperial governance. This interpretation supported Thor's reform agenda by suggesting that returning to proper imperial traditions would prevent similar events in the future. Alternative historical interpretations emerged from various imperial institutions. Administratum analysts produced the structural analysis of hierarchical collapse, which identified specific administrative mechanisms that had enabled Vandire's power consolidation. This technical document, while avoiding direct criticism of imperial institutions, nevertheless suggested that the apostasy resulted from design flaws in governance systems rather than merely from individual corruption. More radical interpretations circulated in scholarly communities on frontier worlds. The anonymous text, Foundations of Tyranny, which appeared simultaneously on multiple worlds in Segmentum Ultima around 420, argued that the apostasy represented the inevitable outcome of the Imperium's increasing religiosity and centralization of power. This document was quickly suppressed by inquisitorial authorities, but copies continued to circulate among intellectual underground networks for centuries. The demographic impact of the apostasy created lasting social changes across the Imperium. Beyond raw population losses, the period saw massive forced relocations that permanently altered the human landscape of thousands of worlds. Vandire's practice of conscripting penitent labor for his cathedral construction projects moved millions of workers from their homeworlds to distant shrine worlds. When these projects collapsed following his death, many survivors lacked the resources to return home, creating permanent diaspora communities. The shrine world of San Lear, where Vandire had first subverted the daughters of the Emperor, hosted over 12 million displaced workers at the height of construction activities. Following the apostasy, approximately 8 million remained, unable or unwilling to return to their original worlds. These displaced populations formed distinct cultural enclaves, maintaining traditions from their homeworlds while gradually integrating into local societies. By the 38th millennium, San Lear's cultural landscape included dozens of distinct ethnic quarters, each with unique architectural styles, culinary traditions, and religious practices that blended their original heritage with local influences. Similar demographic shifts occurred on hundreds of worlds. The fortress world of Terrax, which had served as a major staging area for Fraterist Templar forces, found itself hosting veterans from across the Segmentum Solar after these units were disbanded. These former soldiers, trained in combat but lacking other skills, created significant security challenges until integration programs established by the Administratum provided vocational training and resettlement assistance. The mass executions that had characterized Vandire's reign created specific demographic anomalies that persisted for generations. On worlds where Vandire had ordered the execution of entire administrative classes, the subsequent leadership consisted primarily of hastily promoted junior officials or administrators imported from other worlds. This created governance structures dominated by individuals with limited local knowledge or traditional authority, contributing to administrative dysfunction that lasted well beyond the immediate post-apostasy period. the hive world of Parvus Secundus demonstrated this pattern clearly. Following a minor tithe dispute, Vandire had ordered the execution of all officials above a certain rank, eliminating approximately 17,000 experienced administrators in a single day. The replacement governance structure, assembled from junior clerks and off-world appointees, lacked both the technical knowledge and social connections necessary for effective rule. 3 generations later, Parvus Secundus still suffered from administrative inefficiencies directly traceable to this disruption in leadership continuity. Gender demographics showed particularly significant shifts on worlds that had experienced heavy Fraterus Templar recruitment or suffered from gender-specific purges. Vandire's policies had often targeted men for military conscription while relocating women for labor or administrative service, creating severe gender imbalances in specific age cohorts. These imbalances affected family formation patterns, labor availability, and social stability for decades after the apostasy ended. The cultural trauma of the apostasy manifested in religious practices that persisted long after theological reforms had officially addressed Vandire's doctrinal distortions. Many communities developed ritualized remembrances of apostasy suffering, incorporating them into standard imperial worship. The Litany of Deliverance, which originated on worlds liberated during the Wars of Vindication, became a standard element in ecclesiarchal services across multiple sectors. This prayer, which thanked the emperor for salvation from tyranny while acknowledging the suffering that had preceded it, provided communities with a sanctioned way to process collective trauma through religious expression. More concerning to ecclesiarchal authorities were the martyrs of resistance cults that emerged on worlds that had suffered particularly under Vandire's rule. These informal devotional practices honored local figures who had opposed Vandire's policies, sometimes elevating them to saint-like status despite lacking official ecclesiarchal recognition. While generally orthodox in their theology, these cults sometimes developed practices that emphasized local authority over centralized ecclesiarchal control, precisely the kind of religious fragmentation that Thor's reforms had sought to prevent. The most extreme religious response to the apostasy came in the form of apocalyptic cults that interpreted the period as a sign of the emperor's imminent return in physical form. The largest of these, the returners of Gladius Prime, accumulated thousands of followers who believed that the apostasy had been the great trial described in obscure prophetic texts, which would be followed by the emperor's restoration to active rule. While initially tolerated as harmless, if misguided, these movements occasionally developed into more problematic forms that rejected imperial authority entirely on the grounds that current institutions were merely temporary placeholders until the emperor's return. The physical scars of the apostasy remained visible on thousands of worlds in the form of abandoned construction projects, depopulated regions, and battle damage. The massive cathedral complexes that Vandire had ordered constructed stood partially completed on hundreds of shrine worlds, their unfinished spires and exposed support structures serving as monumental reminders of his hubris. Some were eventually completed according to modified designs, while others were repurposed for practical functions, hospitals, administrative centers, or military installations. Many were simply abandoned, left as colossal ruins that would puzzle archaeologists in future millennia. The Age of Apostasy's influence echoed through imperial doctrine and practice well into the 41st and 42nd millennia, leaving an indelible mark on how the Imperium approached matters of faith, governance, and internal security. The reforms instituted during the Thorian Reformation created institutional safeguards that would shape imperial religious doctrine for thousands of years, establishing patterns of worship and administrative practice that remained largely unchanged even as the Imperium faced new existential threats. The most enduring legacy was the decree passive, the legal instrument that prohibited the ecclesiarchy from maintaining men under arms. This seemingly simple restriction fundamentally reshaped the relationship between spiritual and military authority within the Imperium. Where once cardinals and confessors had commanded their own armies, Post-apostasy, religious leaders were forced to rely on Imperial Guard regiments, planetary defense forces, or the specialized orders militant of the Adepta Sororitas for military protection. This separation of religious authority from direct military control created a crucial firebreak against the kind of power consolidation that had enabled Vandire's rise. When Cardinal Bucharest of the Ophelia sector attempted to build a personal army disguised as Shrine Guardians in the 38th millennium, local planetary governors immediately reported the violation to both the Adeptus Arbites and the Ordo Hereticus. The swift intervention that followed, including the deployment of 3 Sisters of Battle preceptories, demonstrated how thoroughly the prohibition had been internalized by imperial authorities at all levels. The Adepta Sororitas themselves represented perhaps the most visible and active legacy of the apostasy. What had begun as Vandire's personal bodyguard evolved into a complex organization that balanced military capability with theological oversight and humanitarian service. The Order's militant, with their distinctive power armor and unwavering faith, became living reminders of both the dangers of misplaced loyalty and the redemptive power of corrected error. By the 41st millennium, the Sisters of Battle had established themselves as the ecclesiarchy's primary military arm, their incorruptibility and devotion making them particularly effective against threats with a chaotic or heretical dimension. Their presence on battlefield after battlefield, from the defense of High Volcanus against chaos cultists to the purging of the Genestealer infestation on Parnes, demonstrated their evolution from political enforcers to essential components of imperial defense. The non-militant orders of the Sororitas played equally important roles in maintaining the Reformed ecclesiarchy's focus on service rather than domination. The Order's Hospitaller established medical facilities on thousands of worlds, providing care to civilian populations while also supporting military operations. The Order's Famulus embedded themselves with noble houses across the Imperium, ensuring that local governance remained aligned with broader imperial interests. The Order's Dialogus preserved theological knowledge and linguistic expertise, maintaining doctrinal consistency across vast distances and disparate cultures. This balanced approach to religious authority, combining military protection with practical service and theological oversight, reflected Thor's vision of an ecclesiarchy that supported rather than exploited the imperial population. Even as individual cardinals or confessors occasionally attempted to expand their personal power, the institutional structure established during the Thorian Reformation consistently limited such ambitions. The theological impact of the apostasy extended far beyond organizational reforms. The Gathalammer Catechism, the comprehensive doctrinal document produced during Thor's Reformation, established interpretative frameworks that would guide imperial religious thought for millennia. Its careful balance between doctrinal unity and practical flexibility proved particularly important as the Imperium continued to incorporate new worlds and respond to emerging threats. Central to this theological legacy was the concept of faithful skepticism, the principle that true devotion to the emperor required vigilance against those who might misuse his authority. Where pre-apostasy doctrine had emphasized unquestioning obedience to ecclesiarchal authority, post-Thorian teachings included explicit acknowledgement that human institutions could become corrupted despite divine inspiration. This theological nuance created space for legitimate questioning of religious authorities without undermining faith in the emperor himself. The practical implementation of this principle appeared in the protocols of verification adopted by ecclesiarchal authorities throughout the Imperium. These protocols established multiple independent confirmation requirements for significant doctrinal pronouncements or administrative directives. Major theological innovations required approval from conclaves representing different regions and traditions within the ecclesiarchy, preventing any single cardinal or faction from imposing idiosyncratic interpretations. Administrative directives with significant resource implications needed verification from both ecclesiarchal and administratum authorities, creating checks and balances against exploitation. These theological and administrative safeguards proved particularly valuable during periods of limited communication. When warp storms isolated the Orpheus sector for nearly 3 centuries during the late 40th millennium, local ecclesiarchal authorities maintained doctrinal consistency through rigorous application of Thorian principles. Upon re-establishing contact, imperial authorities found that despite the extended isolation, religious practices had remained largely orthodox, with only minor variations that fell within acceptable parameters. The Thorian influence extended into how the Imperium approached matters of internal security and heresy detection. The graduated response doctrine developed during the Wars of Vindication established frameworks for addressing internal threats that balanced security requirements with practical governance needs. This approach distinguished between different categories of deviation: simple error requiring education, willful misinterpretation requiring correction, and genuine heresy requiring elimination, allowing for more efficient use of limited enforcement resources. The Ordo Hereticus, which had been partially compromised during Vandire's reign, emerged from the apostasy with renewed purpose and more clearly defined methodologies. Inquisitors trained in post-apostasy protocols focused on identifying institutional vulnerabilities and systemic corruption rather than merely hunting individual heretics. This preventative approach, while less dramatic than traditional witch hunting, proved more effective at maintaining imperial stability over extended periods. Inquisitor Helena Mordecai's institutional vulnerability assessment methodology, developed in the late 37th millennium, became standard practice for hereticus operations throughout the Imperium. This systematic approach examined administrative structures, communication patterns, and resource allocation systems to identify potential corruption vectors before they could be exploited. When applied to the governance systems of the Hydrafor sector in 738, Mordecai's methodology identified and eliminated a nascent chaos cult that had begun infiltrating tithe collection authorities, preventing potential catastrophe through early intervention rather than costly purges. The philosophical division between Thorian and Horusian approaches to imperial security continued to influence inquisitorial practice into the 41st millennium and beyond. Thorian inquisitors maintained their focus on identifying and supporting potential vessels of the Emperor's will, believing that such divinely guided individuals represented humanity's best hope for navigating increasingly dangerous times. Horusian inquisitors, meanwhile, pursued more interventionist approaches, seeking to create or enhance potential vessels rather than merely identifying natural manifestations. This philosophical tension occasionally erupted into direct conflict, as during the Scaris sector incident in the 897th year of the 41st millennium, when Inquisitor Goldfinger's Thorian cell clashed with Inquisitor Ravash's Horusian operation over the handling of a young psyker who demonstrated unusual connection to the Emperor's psychic presence. Such conflicts remained rare, however, with both factions generally acknowledging their shared ultimate goal despite disagreements over methodology. The practical influence of Thorian thought appeared most clearly in how the Imperium responded to potential living saints, individuals who demonstrated abilities or insights that suggested direct connection to the Emperor's will. Where pre-apostasy authorities might have elevated such individuals to positions of administrative authority, post-Thorian protocols established careful separation between spiritual significance and governance powers. Living saints were honored for their connection to the divine, but rarely granted direct control over imperial institutions. Saint Celestine, whose appearances across multiple battlefields in the late 41st millennium demonstrated seemingly miraculous powers, exemplified this balanced approach. While revered as a manifestation of the Emperor's will and granted significant tactical autonomy in combat operations, Celestine was not integrated into command structures or given authority over non-military matters. This limitation reflected the Thorian principle that divine guidance operated through existing imperial institutions rather than replacing them. The Age of Apostasy's influence on imperial governance extended beyond religious matters to shape how the Imperium approached administrative authority more broadly. The concept of distributed responsibility, ensuring that critical functions required input from multiple independent authorities, became standard practice in imperial governance at all levels. Planetary tithes required verification from both administratum assessors and ecclesiarchal witnesses. Military deployments needed authorization from both operational commanders and logistical authorities. Even astropathic communications were subject to multiple verification protocols to prevent manipulation. These administrative safeguards created inefficiencies that frustrated imperial officials dealing with fast-moving threats, but they also provided resilience against the kind of systemic corruption that had enabled Vandire's rise. When planetary governor Hax of Scintilla attempted to redirect tithe resources to personal projects in the early 41st millennium, the requirement for administratum counter-verification exposed the discrepancies before significant damage could occur. Similar preventative effects appeared consistently across thousands of worlds and centuries of imperial history. As the Imperium entered the final centuries of the 41st millennium, the Age of Apostasy took on new significance as scholars and strategists identified parallels with contemporary challenges. The time of ending, the period of escalating crises that characterized the late 41st millennium, presented institutional stresses reminiscent of those that had preceded Vandire's rise. Increasing warp storm activity disrupted communication and supply lines. Multiple external threats stretched military resources beyond sustainable limits. Religious fervor intensified as populations sought meaning amid growing uncertainty. These parallels prompted renewed study of the apostasy period by imperial authorities seeking to avoid similar catastrophe. The Ordo Hereticus implemented enhanced monitoring of potential vulnerability indicators based on historical patterns from the pre-Vandire period. The Adeptus Administratum established additional verification layers for resource allocation decisions affecting multiple sectors. The ecclesiarchy conducted comprehensive reviews of doctrinal drift in regions experiencing extended isolation. These preventative measures demonstrated how thoroughly the lessons of the apostasy had been internalized by imperial institutions, even as the specific historical details faded from common knowledge. The average imperial citizen might know little about Goge Vandire beyond his status as a reviled arch-heretic, but the governance structures that managed their daily lives remained profoundly shaped by the reforms implemented after his fall. The formation of the Great Rift in the early 42nd millennium created conditions that tested these institutional safeguards as never before. The division of the Imperium into the Imperium Sanctus and Imperium Nihilus, separated by an impassable warp storm of unprecedented scale, recreated the conditions of isolation and communication breakdown that had enabled Vandire's corruption on a far greater scale. Entire segments of the Imperium found themselves cut off from Terra's authority, forced to implement local governance solutions with minimal central oversight. The response to this catastrophic fragmentation revealed both the strengths and limitations of post-apostasy reforms. In the Imperium Sanctus, where communication with Terra remained possible if difficult, the distributed authority structures established after Vandire's fall provided resilience against potential power consolidation. Multiple independent verification requirements prevented ambitious individuals from exploiting the crisis to establish personal fiefdoms, while theological safeguards maintained doctrinal consistency despite communication challenges. In the Imperium Nihilus, however, the situation proved more complex. The complete severing of reliable communication with Terra created conditions where local authorities had no choice but to exercise autonomous judgment. Lord Commander Robute Guilliman's appointment of Tetrarch Decimus Felix as his representative in the Dark Imperium represented an attempt to provide centralized leadership without direct Terran control, a delicate balance reminiscent of the challenges faced during the Thorian Reformation. The emergence of the Primaris Space Marines and the implementation of the Indomitus Crusade introduced additional complications to this already challenging situation. The deployment of these enhanced warriors across both halves of the divided Imperium represented the most significant military reorganization since the Great Crusade itself, creating potential for power shifts that might have alarmed Thorian purists. That these changes were implemented under the direct authority of a returned Primarch, himself a figure of almost religious significance, added theological dimensions to what might otherwise have been purely military considerations. Despite these unprecedented challenges, the fundamental principles established during the Thorian Reformation continued to influence imperial governance and religious practice. The separation of military and religious authority remained intact, with even Guilliman carefully distinguishing between his role as imperial regent and matters of religious doctrine. The Adepta Sororitas maintained their balanced approach to imperial service, adapting to new tactical realities while preserving their essential character. The Inquisition continued its vigilant monitoring of potential corruption, applying lessons from the apostasy to identify and address new vulnerability patterns. As the Imperium faced threats that dwarf even those of Vandire's era, the legacy of the Age of Apostasy provided both warning and guidance. The institutional memory of how quickly human governance could deteriorate without proper safeguards informed defensive measures against new forms of corruption. The historical example of how the Imperium had survived and reformed after near collapse offered hope amid seemingly insurmountable challenges. Most importantly, the theological understanding that emerged from that dark period, balancing faith in the Emperor's divine nature with recognition of human institutional fallibility, provided a framework for maintaining unity despite unprecedented fragmentation. The Age of Apostasy thus remains not merely historical tragedy, but living influence, its lessons embedded in the structures and practices that define the Imperium in its darkest hour. As humanity faces threats that make even Vandire seem a minor villain by comparison, the reforms implemented after his fall continue to provide essential resilience to an Imperium standing at the precipice of destruction. In this way, even the darkest period of internal corruption ultimately strengthened the Imperium for the greater challenges that lay ahead, a redemptive legacy forged in the crucible of humanity's suffering.